Hello. Welcome to the channel if you're new, and welcome back if you're a regular. Tell me where you're from and what time you're listening. Now get comfy and let's begin. I should start by saying that I'm not a firm believer in the paranormal. However, the reason I'm sharing this story is that I can't explain what happened, and it's left me questioning everything. To set the scene, I was a senior in high school during the 2020 to 2021 school year, so my last year of school was, to put it mildly, complicated. Although we were still attending classes in person, there were plenty of rules and protocols due to the virus. To make a long story short, someone in one of my classes contracted COVID, and I had been sitting close enough to them that I was sent home to quarantine for the next 2 weeks. Fun, right? On top of that, my parents didn't want me spreading the virus to anyone else in the house, so I spent most of my time holed up in my room, eating dinner on the opposite side of the kitchen, and most notably, moving all my toiletries out of the bathroom that my sister and I shared. Fortunately, our house had a small bathroom with a shower on the first floor. Unfortunately, that meant that when I went through my nightly routine of brushing my teeth and washing my face, I was left alone downstairs in the dark. As I mentioned, I'm somewhat skeptical of paranormal stuff, but I still get really creeped out being alone in a dark house. So, every night, I rushed through my routine, always on edge, convinced that some terrible monster was lurking in a dark corner, just waiting for me to turn out the last light before it pounced and I'd vanish forever. Of course, in the back of my mind, I knew that was ridiculous. Despite all my fear, I was always sure that I was the only one downstairs during those brief moments when I was the last one awake. That is, until one night when I might have been proven wrong. One important detail is that the downstairs bathroom had 2 doors, one leading to the kitchen and the other to my dad's office. My dad's office also had 2 doors, one that was always closed leading to the bathroom, and one that was always open, facing the base of the staircase. So, one night, just like any other during that week, I was quickly brushing my teeth while keeping an eye on the mirror, making sure nothing was sneaking up behind me. I had just spit out my toothpaste and was rinsing the toothbrush when I heard something. Amidst the rush of water from the faucet, I thought I heard my dad calling my name from the top of the stairs. The sink was loud, and his voice was so soft, so I wasn't entirely sure if I'd heard it correctly. I turned off the water, dried my toothbrush, and strained to listen against the eerie silence that seemed to fill the house. I figured that if I had heard my dad, he'd call my name again to get my attention. So when I didn't hear so much as a breath for the next few seconds, I figured I was just hearing things. I turned the faucet on again and began washing my face. And when I turned it back off, I heard my dad call my name again. This time it was so clear and unmistakable. Not only did I know it was my dad who was calling me, but I was also able to tell that he was on the landing of the staircase slightly closer now. Yeah, I called back, feeling a little sorry that he probably thought I was ignoring him when I really had heard him call my name after all. I waited for a response, tilting my head slightly toward the open doorway leading to the kitchen. However, the response I received was not the one I was expecting. Instead, from the closed door that separated the bathroom from the office, came 3 distinct single-knuckle knocks. I was very confused at this point, wondering why my dad hadn't responded to me, what he needed to tell me that required him coming all the way downstairs to the bathroom, and why he decided to go to the locked door from the office instead of the open one from the kitchen. Now, I could have just opened the door he was standing behind, but for some reason I found myself taking the unnecessarily long route out of the bathroom, through the kitchen, through the hallway, and to the open door to the office. This isn't a decision I remember making. I just did it. In fact, I wasn't thinking about anything, including the fact that I never actually heard my dad's footsteps approach the door or even come down the creaky staircase. And I certainly had no idea what to think. When I turned the corner to look into the office, I stood in the open doorway and strained my eyes against the inky darkness, looking at the spot where my dad should be standing. But he wasn't there. Needless to say, I went straight to my room and turned on every light on the way. It took me a long time to calm myself down and fall asleep that night. All I could think of was staring into the darkness of that office and wondering what might have happened if I had just opened the door when I heard the knocking. My father works as a logger, specifically as a tree saw operator. For those who don't know, a tree saw is a massive machine capable of felling enormous trees and cutting them into specified lengths, which means he often spends a lot of time alone deep in the forest. The way my dad's logging crew was structured is that he would be given a location where trees needed to be felled. He'd go out, cut them down, and was paid based on how many trees he cut, not how long it took. So, he would often work anywhere from 16 to 20 hours a day, trying to get as much done as possible. The rest of the crew would clean up the fallen trees and ship them to the mill. About half the time, my dad worked alone, and the other half, he worked alongside another tree saw operator named Renee. They would communicate over radios when they were working together. Anyway, my dad and Renee were assigned to a new job site. Everything was going smoothly for the first 10 days, but they started hearing strange static over the radio. The chatter was so distorted that no words could be made out. It didn't matter which channel they switched to, it followed them. As they worked further up the mountain, the interference started to clear up a bit, and they could make out bits of conversation. From what they could hear, both of them agreed that something wasn't right. They also began finding odd containers scattered around the area and signs that other people had been there. The location was extremely remote, about a 2.5-hour drive up the mountain. They had to spend 3 weeks just clearing the road so their trucks and equipment could make it. It became clear to them that whoever was up there didn't belong there, and the worst part was that they weren't scheduled to leave for another week. The only time they'd leave was to refuel the trucks or get supplies. One day, Renee came across a tent and called my dad over. They investigated and found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag. Opening the duffel bag, they discovered several pairs of children's underwear and worse, items that appeared to be part of a rape kit. Rope, duct tape, disturbing sketches of children being molested, and photographs of children who seemed unaware they were being photographed. There was also a small amount of food in the tent, including canned goods and an apple, which proved the tent had been recently occupied since there was no mold on the food. Now, they were alone on a mountain with someone who, at best, was seriously messed up. Renee immediately wanted to leave, but my dad, who's the hardest working person I know, insisted that they needed to finish the job first. They decided they would limit their communication over the radios to emergencies, but they kept the radio on to see if they could hear any more of the strange conversations. Soon, they were close enough to hear the voices of 2 men talking over the radio about gathering wood and water for a fire. There was nothing abnormal in the conversation except for the fact that these guys clearly didn't belong there, and the tent almost certainly belonged to them. At the end of the workday, my dad heard the men talking again, one of them mentioning that he was collecting brush for a fire. That's when my dad decided to take action. He grabbed the radio and asked, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" After that, the conversation abruptly stopped, and they never heard from the men again. That night, Renee wakes my dad up and whispers for him to get his gun. Someone's outside. My dad has told me that the first thing he hears when he wakes up is the quiet shuffling of footsteps. My dad fumbles for his gun and finds it, but realizes that he doesn't have it loaded and has next to no idea where his rounds are, and Renee has nothing. And the thought of calling the police is absurd for multiple reasons. They hear a jiggle on the doorknob, and it opens. The camper is far enough off the ground to where you had to jump in, and there is no ladder or footstool. It just stays open, and neither my dad or Renee move. They hear scratching right outside the door though, and after 4 minutes of scratching, my dad can no longer take it and nods at Renee. He quietly gets up and walks towards the camper door, and the second he reaches it, he is met with an intense pain across his right eye and to the left of his cheek. He has been cut and forced to the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife gets on top of him, and he is soon being kicked in the top of the head by a man behind him. Renee leaps off the trailer and manages to get the man off my dad. And my dad gets up and realizes that the second man without a knife is running away. And the man with a knife is scrambling away from Renee and starts running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Renee get into the truck and drive to the nearest hospital to treat my dad's cuts, and later, report the events to the police. They both quit their jobs. And 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew was finishing up the job, one of them was found gagged, bound, raped, murdered, and thrown into a ditch. No one has been convicted of these crimes. To this day, my father can hardly see out of his right eye, and the pupil is disfigured and looks more like a cat's eye than a human's. He suffers from PTSD and hasn't slept a good night's sleep since. I do Uber Eats on weekends and on days when school is out. This happened a couple of weeks before our school's holiday break. It was a Friday night, and I had no plans, so I figured I'd make a few extra bucks instead of staying bored at home all evening. I started up the app and began accepting orders. The weather wasn't snowing, but it was really cold and windy, with a thin layer of snow still on the roads from earlier that day. I think I started around 6 p.m., and after completing a few orders, I got one to pick up from a nearby Burger King. Once I grabbed the food, I checked the app to see where I was supposed to deliver it. At first, it was obvious the address wasn't a house, but as I zoomed in on the map, I was a little confused to see the drop-off location was at the corner of two streets, which seemed like it might be a gas station. Although it was a bit odd, I clicked Begin Route and drove over. I didn't think it was anything bad, just an unusual interaction, since I'd probably have to find the person in the parking lot and hand it to them directly. Usually, I don't meet the customers face-to-face and just drop the order off quickly. As I got closer to the intersection, I saw the gas station exactly where the app had directed me. The station itself looked normal, but there were no cars in the parking lot. I parked at the back of the lot, stayed in my car, and started looking around for anyone. The app should have notified the customer that I had arrived, so I expected them to come out soon. But after a couple of minutes, no one showed up. I sent a text through the app, letting them know I was waiting in the parking lot. I then got out of the car to look around, hoping to spot someone. The intersection was completely empty. No cars were passing by, and all the businesses across the street appeared to be closed for the night. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I started to feel. I checked my phone again, still seeing no response from the customer. Just as I was about to get back into my car, a truck pulled into the gas station. It passed the pumps and parked just a couple of spots away from me. It was an older, dark red pickup with tinted windows. The first thought that crossed my mind was, why would they order delivery if they were just going to drive here themselves? At first, I thought maybe they were a worker at the gas station or just hanging out there for some reason, but now it seemed far more suspicious than before. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. From one glance, he looked very disheveled, like someone who'd been living on the road. His clothes were dirty, stained, and torn. As he walked toward me, I held up the food bag with a slight smile, but the man didn't even glance at it. He kept his gaze fixed on me as he got closer, and something about him made me feel like I needed to leave immediately. I quickly set the bag on the ground and started walking back to my car. As soon as I made the move to leave, the man started walking faster, almost as if he knew I was about to get out of there. I got into my car, began backing out, and just as the man reached my door, he ran back to his truck, leaving the food behind. I floored it, driving through a red light and speeding down the road until I reached a busier area with more cars around. The truck followed me for a moment, but eventually, it turned off and drove in a different direction. Once I felt safe, I called the police, but nothing came of it. In the heat of the moment, I never thought to check his license plate, and now I'm not even sure if he had one. I have no idea what his intentions were or what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. But knowing how close I was to finding out still sends a chill down my spine. The rain was coming down in sheets, obscuring the lonely stretch of highway ahead. I never should have stopped to help that stranded motorist, but I did. And now, I'm fighting for my life, praying I'll see the dawn. My name's Mike, and I'm just an ordinary guy who made one fatal mistake. I was driving home after a late shift at the factory, eager to get back to my wife and kids. The storm had been raging for hours, and I was looking forward to a hot shower and my warm bed. That's when I saw her. A woman standing next to a broken-down car, waving frantically. In retrospect, I should have known better. It was past midnight, in the middle of nowhere. but I've always been the type to lend a hand, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving someone stranded in this weather. I pulled over, rolling down my window just enough to hear her over the pounding rain. "Oh, thank God!" she cried, her blonde hair plastered to her face. "My car just died, and I have no cell service out here. Could you please help me?" I hesitated for a moment, but her pleading eyes and the ferocity of the storm won me over. "Hop in," I said. "We can drive to the next town and call for a tow." Relief washed over her face as she quickly got into the passenger seat. "Thank you so much," she said, shivering. "I'm Mike," I replied, pulling back onto the road. "There's a diner about 20 miles up ahead. We can stop there and get you some help." As we drove, Sarah chatted nervously, telling me about her job as a nurse and how she was heading home after visiting her sister. I nodded along, keeping my eyes on the treacherous road. Suddenly, Sarah gasped. "Oh no, I left my purse in my car. All my cards and ID are in there. Could we please go back?" she asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. I glanced at the clock. It was already so late, and the weather was only getting worse. But I couldn't just leave her stranded without her belongings.
"All right," he sighed.
"But let's make it quick." As I executed a careful U-turn, I failed to notice Sarah reaching into her jacket pocket. It wasn't until I felt something cold and hard pressing against my ribs that I realized how badly I'd messed up. "Keep driving," Sarah said, her voice now hard and cold. "And don't try anything stupid." My heart began to race as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "What's going on? What do you want?" "Just drive," she snapped. "Take the next right." I did as I was told, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to guys like me. I was just a factory worker, a family man. I didn't have any enemies, didn't owe anyone money. Why me? We drove for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up. Sarah directed me down increasingly remote roads, deeper into the countryside. Finally, we pulled up to an old farmhouse, its windows dark and uninviting. Parked behind the barn, Sarah ordered. As soon as I cut the engine, the passenger door opened. A man appeared, his face hidden by the shadows in rain. He yanked me out of the car, quickly zip-tying my hands behind my back. "Good work, babe," he said to Sarah. "Let's get him inside before anyone drives by." They marched me into the farmhouse, shoving me down onto a rickety chair in what must have been the living room. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the peeling wallpaper. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "I don't have any money if that's what this is about." The man chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Oh, this isn't about money, Mike. At least not your money." Sarah perched on the arm of a moth-eaten couch, smirking. "You see, Mike, you're what we in the business call a good Samaritan. Always ready to help a damsel in distress. Makes you predictable, easy to manipulate." My blood ran cold as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't a random crime. They had targeted me specifically. But why? The man pulled up another chair, sitting down across from me. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to call your lovely wife, Karen, and tell her that you've been in an accident. You need her to withdraw $50,000 from your joint account and bring it to a location we specify. No cops, no questions." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you insane? We don't have that kind of money. And how do you know my wife's name?" He leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. "We know everything about you, Mike. Your job at the factory, your 2 kids, Emily and Jason, the mortgage you're struggling to pay. We've been watching you for weeks." My mind raced, trying to process this information. How had I never noticed? How long had they been planning this? "Why me?" I managed to ask. Sarah laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Why not you? Middle-class family man, steady job, good credit score. You're the perfect mark. Banks don't ask questions when people like you need a sudden loan." "But we can't get that much money," I protested. "The bank won't just hand over $50,000 even if we asked." The man's eyes hardened. "Then you better be very convincing when you talk to Karen, because if that money doesn't show up well." He pulled out a knife, running his thumb along the blade. Let's just say it won't end well for you or your family. Fear gripped me like a vice. These people knew where I lived, knew about my family. Even if I somehow got away, they could still hurt Karen and the kids. Okay, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I'll do it. Just please don't hurt my family. The man nodded, seemingly satisfied. He pulled out a burner phone and dialed my home number, then held it up to my ear. Karen answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. Hello, Karen. It's me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mike, what's wrong? Where are you? I took a deep breath, silently praying she would understand. I've been in an accident. I'm okay, but I need your help. I need you to go to the bank first thing in the morning and withdraw $50,000 from our account. There was a long pause. What? Mike, what's going on? Should I call the police? I could feel the man's eyes boring into me. No police. Please, Karen, just do as I say. I'll explain everything later. I need you to take the money to the old Miller farm on Route 7. Come alone. Another pause. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. Red or blue? My heart skipped a beat. Years ago, Karen and I had come up with a simple code in case of emergencies. Red meant danger, call for help. Blue meant play along. I have a plan. Blue, I said, hoping my captors wouldn't notice anything amiss. Definitely blue. Okay. Karen replied, her voice stronger now. I understand. I'll do exactly as you said. Be safe, Mike. I love you. The call ended, and the man took the phone away. Not bad, he said. Let's hope your wife is as cooperative in person. The next few hours were a blur of anxiety and fear. I was tied to the chair, left alone in the dark room while my captors discussed their plans in hushed tones in the kitchen. I strained to hear what they were saying, but could only catch snippets. As dawn began to break, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My heart leaped into my throat. Karen was here. The man and Sarah tensed, peering out the window. Suddenly, their faces changed from anticipation to confusion, then to anger. Shit, the man yelled. It's the cops. Everything happened so fast after that. The sound of car doors slamming. Shouts of police. Come out with your hands up. The man and Sarah scrambled, looking for an escape route. But it was too late. The door burst open, and suddenly, the room was filled with police officers. In the chaos, I saw Karen rush in, her eyes wild with fear and relief as she spotted me. As an officer untied me, the full story came out. Karen had recognized the distress code and called the police immediately. They'd set up a sting operation, using the money drop as bait to catch my kidnappers. The man and Sarah were led away in handcuffs, their elaborate scheme in ruins. As Karen hugged me tightly, I finally let myself break down, the stress and fear of the night catching up with me all at once. In the days that followed, we learned more about the failed plot. The couple had been running the scam for months, targeting Good Samaritans across 3 states. They had been watching our family, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. As I gave my statement to the detective, he shook his head in disbelief. You're lucky, Mr. Thompson. If you and your wife hadn't had that code, this could have ended very differently. I nodded, still processing how close I'd come to disaster. I guess no good deed goes unpunished, I said. The detective smiled grimly. Sometimes, but don't let this change who you are, he added. The world needs more Good Samaritans. Just maybe be a little more cautious next time. As we left the police station, Karen squeezed my hand. You okay? She asked softly. I thought about the terror of that night, the helplessness I'd felt. But I also thought about the courage Karen had shown and the quick thinking that had saved my life. Yeah, I said, managing a small smile. I think I will be. The rain had finally stopped. As we stepped out into the sunlight, I felt a glimmer of hope. The world could be a dangerous place, full of people waiting to take advantage of kindness. But it was also full of love, bravery, and small acts of heroism. I may think twice before stopping for a stranded motorist in the future, but I won't stop trying to be one of the good guys. After all, that's who Karen fell in love with. That's who my kids look up to. And that's who I am, come rain or shine. The moment I saw him standing in my kitchen, stirring a cup of coffee he'd made in my own mug, I knew my life would never be the same. There's a special kind of terror that comes with finding a stranger in your home, a violation so deep it rattles you to your core. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that was about to unfold. It had been a long day at work, one of those soul-crushing shifts where everything that could possibly go wrong did. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, all I wanted was a hot shower, a glass of wine, and the mind-numbing comfort of reality TV. I trudged up the stairs, fumbling with my keys, my mind already on the leftover pizza waiting in my fridge. I should have noticed something was off the moment I opened the door. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that felt wrong somehow. But I was too tired, too consumed by my own thoughts to pay attention to that nagging feeling creeping up from the back of my mind. I tossed my keys on the little table by the door, kicked off my shoes, and made my way to the kitchen. That's when I saw him. He was standing at my counter, his back to me, stirring a mug of what smelled like coffee. For a split second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. Maybe I'd walked into the wrong apartment, but no. There was the tacky fruit bowl my mom had given me, the magnets on the fridge spelling out sarcastic messages. Before I could react, before I could scream, run, or do any of the things you're supposed to do when you find an intruder in your home, he turned around. "Hey there," he said, his voice calm and friendly, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "You're home early." I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. He was older than me, probably in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of face you'd expect to see on a kindly uncle. But his eyes, there was something off about his eyes. They didn't match the easy smile on his face. Who are you?" I managed to stammer out, my hand still on the doorknob, ready to bolt. He chuckled, taking a sip from the mug. My mug, I realized with a sudden jolt. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, "but I won't. I already know." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, you know?" I asked, voice shaking. "This is my apartment," he said, setting the mug down, his movements slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be here." I felt like I was trapped in some twisted dream. Nothing made sense. "Of course, I'm sure," I said, my voice rising. "I've lived here for 3 years. You need to leave. Now." His smile never faltered, but something shifted in his eyes. A hardness, a glint of something dangerous. 3 years? He said, voice low and mocking. "That's cute." My hand trembled on the doorknob. I needed to run, to get out of there, to call the police. But my feet felt as if they were glued to the spot. "Look," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I don't know who you are or how you got in here, but you need to go. I'm calling the police." I reached for my phone, but he was faster. In 2 quick strides, he crossed the kitchen and was standing in front of me. I hadn't realized how tall he was until that moment, how he seemed to loom over me. "You're not calling anyone," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We're gonna have a little chat, you and me, about who really belongs here." I backed away, my heart racing. "Please," I said, hating how weak my voice sounded. "Just take whatever you want and go. I won't call the cops, I swear." He laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not here to rob you. I'm here to reclaim what's mine." I turned to run, but he caught my arm in a grip like iron. "Not so fast," he growled. "We're not done here." I struggled against his hold, panic rising in my chest. "Let go of me," I shouted, hoping against hope that one of my neighbors would hear. But his next words froze me in place. "No one can hear you," he said, his voice eerily calm. "No one's gonna come save you because you're not really here, are you?" I stared at him, confusion mixing with fear. "What are you talking about?" He pulled me closer, his face inches from mine. I could smell coffee on his breath mixed with something metallic. "This apartment, this life you think you've been living for 3 years, it's not real. None of it is real." I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words. "You're crazy," I said. "Of course, this is real. I have memories. I have implanted," he cut me off. "All of it. Memories, feelings, this whole identity you've created. But it's time to wake up now. Time to remember who you really are. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The room seemed to shift and waver, like I was looking at it through water. No, I whispered. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. He released my arm, but I no longer felt the urge to run. My legs were shaking so badly I wasn't sure they could support me. Sit down, he said, gesturing to one of the kitchen chairs. Let me explain. Against my better judgment, I sank into the chair. He sat across from me, those unsettling eyes never leaving my face. You're not who you think you are, he began. Your real name is Sarah Jennings. You're a deep cover operative for a government agency so secret, most people in power don't even know it exists. 3 years ago, you were sent on a mission. Something went wrong. You were captured. Your mind was altered. This, he gestured around the apartment. This is all a construct, a prison built in your own mind. I shook my head, feeling tears start to well up in my eyes. No, that's impossible. I have a job, I have friends, I have a life here. He leaned forward, his voice softening. Think about it. Really think. Can you remember your childhood? Your parents? Faces? The name of your first pet? Or are those memories fuzzy, indistinct? I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him, of course, I remembered those things. But as I searched my mind, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't. My past was a blur, a series of vague impressions rather than clear memories. This can't be real, I whispered, more to myself than to him. But it is, he said. And now it's time to leave. We've finally found you, finally figured out how to break through the mental blocks. But we don't have much time. As if on cue, I heard a sound like distant thunder. The walls of the apartment seemed to vibrate, books falling from shelves, pictures rattling on the walls. What's happening? I asked, panic rising in my voice. He stood up, holding out his hand to me, and the construct is collapsing. Your captors know we're here. We need to go now. I stared at his outstretched hand, my mind reeling. Part of me still wanted to believe this was all some elaborate hoax, that any moment I'd wake up, and this would all be a bad dream. But deep down, in a place I hadn't even known existed, something stirred, a recognition, a sense of truth in his words. How do we get out? I heard myself asking, even as another part of me screamed that this was insanity. You have to let go, he said. Let go of this false life, these false memories. Remember who you really are. The rumbling grew louder. Cracks began to appear in the walls, spreading like spider webs across the ceiling. I could feel the floor shifting beneath my feet. I closed my eyes, trying to focus. Who was I? What was real? Images flashed through my mind. Training sessions, covert meetings, a life I didn't recognize but somehow knew was mine. When I opened my eyes, the apartment was disintegrating around us. Through the cracks, I could see not the hallway or the apartment next door, but a swirling void of color and light. Sarah, the man said, his voice urgent. It's time. Take my hand. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and suddenly I knew him, not as a stranger, not as an intruder, but as someone I trusted with my life. I reached out and took his hand. The world exploded around us in a cacophony of sound and light. I felt like I was falling, drowning, being torn apart and put back together all at once. And then I woke up. I was lying on a cold metal table, wires and tubes connected to my body. The room around me was stark and clinical, filled with beeping machines and concerned faces. Welcome back, Agent Jennings, a voice said. I turned to see the man from the apartment, my handler, I now remembered, standing beside me. You've been gone a long time, he continued. We've got a lot of work to do. As the memories of my real life came flooding back, I felt a pang of loss for the simple, ordinary existence I'd left behind. But I also felt a surge of purpose, of rightness. This was who I was meant to be. I sat up, wincing at muscles stiff from disuse. All right, I said, my voice hoarse but determined. Let's get to work. The life I'd known was gone, shattered like the illusion it had always been. But a new life, my real life, was just beginning. And this time I was ready for whatever challenges it might bring. The beam of my headlamp sliced through the inky blackness, revealing a narrow passage that seemed to stretch endlessly into the depths of the earth. The air was heavy with dust and the musty scent of forgotten histories. I took a deep breath, attempting to steady my pounding heart. This was it, the fabled lost copper mine, untouched for more than a century. We had found it, but soon I would realize that some things are best left undisturbed. Are you sure about this, Alex? Sarah's voice echoed off the stone walls, filled with a blend of excitement and doubt. I turned to face my companions, Sarah, Mike, and Jess. Their faces were pale in the cold glow of our headlamps, a mixture of nerves and the thin layer of dust that clung to everything in the cavernous space. Come on, guys, I said, trying to sound upbeat. We've been planning this for months. We can't back out now. The truth was, I was just as uneasy as they were. We were seasoned hikers, but when it came to spelunking, we were complete amateurs. The old mine shaft we had stumbled upon, hidden behind thick brush, wasn't marked on any of our maps. It felt like sheer luck, or perhaps fate, that we had found it. Mike stepped forward, always the cautious one. I don't know, Alex. This place looks pretty unstable. Maybe we should call it in. Let the pros handle it? I shook my head. And let them take all the credit? No way. We found this place. We should be the ones to explore it. Jess, typically the most cautious of us, surprised me by nodding in agreement. Alex is right. We might not get another shot like this. I say we go for it. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, squared her shoulders and gave a nod. All right, but we stick together. No wandering off alone. With that, we began our descent deeper into the earth. The tunnel gently sloped downward, its walls supported by old, creaking wooden beams that groaned as we passed. Our headlamps cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to mock our intrusion into this long-forgotten place. As we ventured farther, the remnants of the mine's past started to emerge. Rusted pickaxes and shovels were scattered across the floor, and here and there, the remains of ancient mining carts sat motionless, their wheels seized by decades of disuse. This is incredible, Jess whispered, her sharp eye as an archaeologist noting every small detail. It's like stepping back in time. I couldn't help but agree. Despite the oppressive darkness and the unsettling sense that we shouldn't be here, there was an undeniable thrill coursing through me. We were the first people to lay eyes on these sites in over a century. We had been walking for about an hour when we came to a fork in the tunnel. Both paths stretched into darkness, giving no clue as to where they might lead. Which way? Sarah asked, shining her light down each passage in turn. I pulled out the old map we'd found in the town archives. It was faded and torn, barely legible in places, but it was the best guide we had. After studying it for a moment, I pointed to the left tunnel. This way, if I'm reading this correctly, it should lead us to the main excavation chamber. We continued on, the tunnel growing narrower and the air becoming thicker with dust. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from unseen crevices. Suddenly, Mike stopped short, causing Jess to bump into him from behind. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, straining our ears. For a moment, I heard nothing but the pounding of my own heart. Then, faintly, I caught it. A low rumbling sound, like distant thunder. It's probably just the wind, I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. Come on, we must be getting close. But as we pressed on, the rumbling grew louder. Small pebbles began to skitter across the ground, and a fine dust rained down from above. Alex, Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. I really think we should turn back. I was about to agree when suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a vast chamber. Our headlamps couldn't reach the far walls or the ceiling, giving the impression that we were standing on the edge of an abyss. This is it, I breathed. The main chamber. As our eyes adjusted, we began to make out shapes in the darkness. Huge, rusted machinery loomed like sleeping giants. Piles of rock and debris created an alien landscape. And there, glinting in the beam of my headlamp, was a vein of copper ore running through the rock face. We had found it, the mother lode that had eluded miners for decades. Our excitement was short-lived, however. The rumbling, which had faded to background noise, suddenly intensified. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Earthquake, Mike yelled, but I knew it was worse than that. The years of neglect, the weight of the earth above us, and our own intrusion had destabilized the already precarious mine. It was collapsing. Run! I shouted, already turning back towards the tunnel. We scrambled back the way we had come, the rumbling growing to a deafening roar. Rocks began to fall around us, small at first, then larger. I heard Jess cry out in pain as one struck her shoulder, but we couldn't stop. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember from our journey in. Had we taken a wrong turn? The dust was so thick now that our headlamps were nearly useless, creating a disorienting strobe effect as we ran. A particularly violent tremor knocked us all off our feet. As I struggled to stand, I realized with horror that I could no longer see the others. Sarah, Mike, Jess, I called out, my voice hoarse from the dust. Over here. I heard Sarah's voice, faint and muffled. I moved towards the sound, my hand on the wall to keep my bearings. I found Sarah helping Jess to her feet. Jess's face was streaked with tears and dust, and she was cradling her arm. Where's Mike? I asked, dreading the answer. Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know. We got separated when we fell. Another tremor shook the tunnel and more rocks fell. We had to keep moving. Mike, I shouted one last time, straining to hear a response over the rumbling of the collapsing mine. Nothing. With a heavy heart, I grabbed Sarah's hand. We have to go. Now. We ran, half blind, through the crumbling tunnel. Every step could have been our last. Every rumble potentially signaling a cave in that would bury us alive. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any longer, I saw it. A faint glimmer of natural light appeared ahead. The exit. With one last surge of energy, we sprinted toward it, the mine's walls groaning as rocks tumbled all around us. The entire structure seemed to be alive, writhing in its final moments. We burst through the tunnel and kept running, not stopping until we were far away from the mine entrance. When we turned to look back, the entire hillside seemed to tremble before it collapsed inward, sending a massive cloud of dust into the air. We stood there, panting for breath, covered in dust and blood from countless small cuts. Alive but shell-shocked. Mike! Jess cried, sobbing and clutching her injured arm. He's still in there. The full reality of what had just happened began to sink in. We had entered that mine 4 strong, full of excitement and curiosity. Now, standing here, we were only 3, broken, battered, and shaken. As the dust began to settle, we heard something. A cough, weak but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the collapsed entrance. Our hearts leaped. We rushed over, not daring to hope. And there, crawling out from beneath a fallen tree that had somehow shielded him from the worst of the collapse, was Mike. Covered in dust, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but alive. We helped him to his feet, none of us able to say a word. We were all too overwhelmed, too relieved to speak. We had survived just barely. The mine, with its secrets and treasures, was gone, swallowed by tons of rock and earth. As we slowly made our way back to civilization, my mind kept drifting back to the miners who had come before us. How many had been claimed by the mountain's insatiable hunger? How many had glimpsed the glint of copper and pressed on, ignoring the risks, only to be consumed by the earth they sought to conquer? We had been lucky. We had escaped with our lives, but we weren't untouched. The experience had changed us. We had set out in search of adventure and riches, only to find a brutal reminder of nature's might and the fragility of our existence. The lost copper mine would remain lost, its secrets buried deeper than ever. And we, the foolish explorers who had dared disturb its resting place, would carry the weight of that experience with us for the rest of our lives. Some things we had learned are better left undisturbed. I'm trans. female to male, and not yet in a place where I can safely transition. I do my best to dress as masculine as possible, but I have days when my anxiety, fear of people, and depression take over, and I end up throwing on whatever clothes I can find just to avoid the world. I don't wear dresses or skirts, and I avoid anything that would draw attention to my body or my hair. I don't wear makeup or try to dress up to get noticed. I have a soft face, I'm overweight, and I obviously look exhausted because I don't sleep much. I'm also very short. This happened on one of those off days where I was just struggling to get by, but adulting calls and I had to go to the bank. I had no one to come with me, and I couldn't take my ESA because of the weather and because they don't have the same rights as a service dog. I had taken a prescription to help calm me down a little before leaving, but it didn't do much. When I got to the bank, I noticed an older, bald man. He didn't stand out to me. I was just wrapped up in my own anxiety. He looked Middle Eastern, with tan skin and features that suggested that, and he was dressed in a nice suit. As I was waiting for the tellers to let me into the main building, he kindly pointed out a newly installed button to help me get in, and I thanked him, thinking that was the end of it. I went about my business, deposited my check, and felt a little better. I didn't see anyone outside, so I stepped into the ATM hallway to make a quick withdrawal. When I turned around, he was right behind me, standing by the main exit. I could have taken the side exit or gone back inside, but I figured I was just being paranoid. Then he spoke. No, he said. Hey, my name is Brian. What's your name? I was already feeling overwhelmed, especially since the conversation was in French, and my stutter started to worsen with each word. I responded quietly, "You're welcome," and tried to keep the conversation short. "You're very beautiful. Can I have your number?" "No," I said, still trying to stay calm. "Thank you, but I don't like to talk on the phone. I have anxiety." "Come on," he persisted. "Just give me your number." "I'm sorry. I don't want to. I have an anxiety disorder." "That's okay. Just give me your number." This was getting too much for me. I moved to the door and he kept pressuring me to give him my number. No matter how much I apologized or tried to get out of it, he kept talking to me. Eventually, I gave it to him out of pure panic to get away, but by some stroke of luck, he misheard me because of my stutter. He read it back to me, asked me to repeat the number, and I went with it. He finally bid me a good day and left, reassuring me that he'd phone me at 6. At this point, I thought I was home free. I didn't live far from the bank and walked up a one-way street into an alley off the main street to try and avoid him. There were huge planters blocking traffic going up, so I thought I was safe. Just as I stepped out, I heard a car rumbling through and the large white van with tinted windows sped through. On the opposite side of the alley was another one-way street leading in the opposite direction. The van nearly collided with a car going the right way up. I had been waiting for that car to pass to get into a pedestrian-only laneway across the street, so I quickly jumped back on the sidewalk. The van honked, turned around, and pulled up in front of me, blocking my way. The tinted windows rolled down, and there was Brian. "Hey, get in the car. I'll drive you home." It had begun to drizzle, but I was 2.5 blocks from home and visibly scared of him. "No, thanks. I don't have far to go. Come on, just get in." This went on and on until he seemed to grow tired of it. He left after reassuring me again that he'd call me. I was wary and took the sidewalks this time, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a white car at the end of the block. I figured that he was just trying to get out of this little borough and kept walking, but it didn't make sense. I had been walking slowly and he should have been out of the borough by then. The next block, same thing. He was still there following me along the street going the same way. My block was the last one you can drive down before having to turn onto a main road, but the street I was on went 1 block further. I ignored my turn. A gut feeling told me to keep going. I called my brother at the end of the block, mostly hidden by a big tree. I watched my street and asked him if the white van was there. As I was standing, his van slowly rolled into view at the intersection. If I had gone up my block, he would have seen me on the way back down the street. Somehow, he didn't notice me and I stood there quietly, making sure he wasn't making another round. He didn't, and I made it home safe and sound, but very shaken up. Thankfully, I never received a call from him. I'm 19 now, but this happened when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I'm not a religious person at all, and I'm the type of person who needs to see something to believe it. When people tell me stories about supernatural experiences, I usually try to come up with a logical explanation. But what happened to me all those years ago shook me to my core, and I still avoid talking about it because thinking back to that time brings me to tears. As a kid, I wasn't into scary movies or ghost stories. I was scared of the dark and had a real struggle with bedtime. My mom would sit by my bed until I fell asleep, but I'd always wake up around 2 a.m., terrified of being alone. I'd get up and walk down the hall to her room, climb into her bed, and fall back to sleep. At that time, it was just me, my older sister, and my mom in the house. The first incident happened on one of those nights when I woke up in the middle of the night and got up to go to my mom's room. When I opened the door, I saw it. There was an extremely pale, short, bald man sitting in the middle of her bed. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. His head slowly turned toward me, and his face was completely smooth. No eyes, no mouth, just a pale, powdered white face. The moment he looked up at me, I collapsed onto the floor, screaming and crying for my mom to wake up. She jumped out of bed and rushed over to me, trying to calm me down. I kept telling her there was a man in her room, but she insisted it was just a bad dream and told me to go back to bed. I looked around the room, desperately trying to show her, but the man was gone. After calming down a bit, I asked if we could both stay in my room for the night because I was too scared to sleep alone, but I couldn't go back to her room after what I'd just seen. The next morning, I tried to explain what happened to my mom, but she dismissed it again as a bad dream. I was sure of what I had seen, so I tried to tell my sister, but she just brushed me off too. After that, I was terrified that it would happen again. The nights following were horrible. My mom would tuck me into bed and wait until I fell asleep before leaving. But now, I was so scared of falling asleep that I would get up when she left, turn on all the lights in my room, and play with my action figures or my PlayStation until morning. During the day, I would nap on the couch, but my mom didn't like that. She wanted me to go outside and play so I could sleep well at night. But that just made me lose a lot of sleep because I was too scared to sleep at night, but I couldn't sleep during the day either. Those nights, and the fear of what I saw, stayed with me for a long time. Even now, I can't explain it, but I know what I saw that night. It had been about 2 or 3 weeks since the first incident, and I was starting to convince myself that maybe my mom was right, that it had all just been a dream. One day, I was especially exhausted, so I fell asleep on the couch in the living room and ended up sleeping through most of the night. When I woke up, it was pitch black, and I immediately started to panic. Even when I was in my own room, I always had night lights on for comfort, so this total darkness was terrifying. I got off the couch and tried to use the faint light from the TV as a guide to walk toward my room. My room was the first one in the hall, just off the living room. When I reached my room and opened the door, that man was sitting on the edge of my bed. I was paralyzed with fear, but I somehow managed to close the door quietly, hoping he hadn't seen me. I immediately ran to my mom's room, screaming and crying again, telling her the man was in my room. She got up and walked with me to my room, but of course, there was nothing there. I remember feeling so confused, questioning what was real and what wasn't. At that point, I told my mom that I wanted to go stay with my dad because I was too scared to stay at her place anymore. After talking to my dad, I told him everything that had been happening, and he decided I could come live with him. Talking to him about it was difficult because, honestly, he didn't believe me. He thought I was just having bad dreams from watching scary movies at my mom's house. Fast forward a few years. My mom remarried a man who had 3 children, the youngest of whom was 6 years old. Over time, the youngest boy started to experience the same things I had when I lived there. When my mom told me he was saying the same things I had said, I almost wanted to say, "I told you so." But by this point, my mom believed me. Not long after, she sold the house. We now just refer to that old place as the haunted house. It's hard to talk about it with other people, though. For some reason, when I do, my eyes water, and I just feel terrified even thinking about it. I just wanted to share this here because it feels good to get it off my chest. This story has a happy ending, I promise. It's a recount of some unsettling events from my college years and, believe it or not, the most incredible example of the bro sixth sense I have ever seen. So, without further delay, let me introduce you to Kevin. Kevin was a classmate of mine, and we were in the same group for several subjects each year, about 5 or 6 classes together. Kevin was, well, he was a bit odd. Not because there was anything physically wrong with him, he was actually quite cute. He was a little nerdy on the shorter and scrawnier side, with blonde hair, big blue eyes, and a few fluffy chin hairs instead of a full beard. If I had to compare him to something, I'd say he resembled a cute little baby chicken, if baby chickens were somehow destined to grow up to be serial killers. More on that later. At first, I didn't really notice him. There were a lot of people in my class, everything was new, and I didn't know anyone except for a guy named Harper, who I knew from my sports days. We often competed against each other, exchanged colorful insults on the track, and then went out for drinks. Harper is important to the story, so remember that. As I said, I only knew Harper, and there were only 6 other girls in my class since I had chosen courses that weren't of much interest to the female college crowd. Over time, I made friends, and I became particularly close with 3 other geeky guys. Zachary, whom I briefly dated, Steve, who turned out to have the same college as my mom, leading to an instant friendship, and Rick, with whom I shared many interests. So, by this point, the important guys were Harper, Zachary, Steve, and Rick. These guys would later become my personal army. And then there was Kevin, cute Kevin, whom I made the mistake of asking for notes from a lecture I missed because I overslept. I went up to him and asked, "Hey, got the notes from this morning?" Apparently, that translated into, "I'm totally interested in you. Oh, magnificent Kevin." That's when things took a weird turn. Kevin's response made me think he had developed an unhealthy fixation, and I unknowingly gave him the impression that I was just as obsessed. I borrowed his notes, copied what I needed, and gave his notebook back. What I didn't see was that Kevin sniffed the notebook when I had my back turned. Zachary was the first to notice it and snorted with laughter when he told me. My immediate reaction? To sniff myself to see if I smelled or something. I was young and naive then, so the sniffing was less what's wrong with him and more what's wrong with me, and that's where it all went downhill. All the next few weeks, Kevin would always be there, never talking to anyone precisely, just kind of staring at me when we were in class, when we had breaks and went for coffee to the shop outside. And then he started showing up for classes we did not attend together and said he simply arrived too early for his later classes. He never participated, just sat there in the back. Also, Kevin had a sort of aura about him, like you didn't have to look at the door to know when he entered the room. You just felt his eyes on the back of your head and kind of wished for a shower. I didn't worry too much until one day I went to the women's bathroom during a break. I did my business, went to the front section to wash my hands. In came Kevin. I was alone. Kevin turned, closed the door behind him, and locked it. Needless to say, I was confused and unsure of what to do. So I just stared at him and asked him if he needed something. "Hi," he said, and then proceeded with, "How are you?" Like he hasn't just locked himself in the women's bathroom with me for no fathomable reason. I realized something was very, very wrong and attempted not to panic, managing to keep a nonchalant expression and turn towards the mirror so I could still see him and pretend to fix my makeup. "It's fine," I said and spoke no more. I could see Kevin's fidgeting, playing with the key nervously, and after a long and uncomfortable silence, an eternity really, I heard loud banging from the other side of the door. It was Harper and Steve, Harper yelling something like, "Kevin, get your scrawny butt out here and open the door." I swear to God, in the next 10 seconds, the door ain't gonna be the only thing I'm breaking. I could hear Steve behind him sounding a bit panicked, telling him to move since he managed to get the spare key. Kevin paled and stepped away, the key he had falling somewhere to the floor. Steve and Harper unlocked the door, and Harper jumped on Kevin like a primate and knocked him to the floor while Steve and Rick, who was there as well, got inside and all but dragged me out of the bathroom area. None of them wanted to tell me what or why or how any of that happened, but I pushed at the weakest link, Rick, when we were alone and found out that a whole hour prior to all of that, Rick overheard Kevin asking one of the on-campus students, the guys who got some extra cash if they helped with paperwork fixing and cleaning the campus, for the ladies' bathroom key and paying him for it. Rick didn't know why Kevin would need that key but knew that Kevin was a weirdo, so he figured it couldn't be good. Later on, Steve was looking for me and asked Rick if he had seen me, and stuff kind of clicked for Rick. They asked around, and people told them they saw me go to the bathroom area and I didn't come out yet. More confirmed, they saw Kevin going there too and joked that there must have been a makeout session going on inside. Steve immediately connected the dots. Harper overheard him talking to Rick, and they went to break me free from Kevin's affections while Steve ran to get the extra key from the janitor. Kevin appeared with a light black eye in class 2 days later and just wishing to forget the whole thing. I pretended he didn't even exist. I wished this was the end of it. A week or two went by. I figured he'd learned his lesson. He's leaving me alone. But then he got the wind in his sails back for some reason and proceeded with attempting to sit next to me in class. He was so insistent that Zachary got involved and how the guys Harper, Zach, Steve, and Rick made a timetable. So 22 would attend classes at all times when I was there so each could sit on either side of me. I never asked any of this of them. They just insisted. After a few failed attempts, Kevin gave up and settled for sitting in the back, glaring at my back and the 2 guys on duty that day. I wish this was the end of it. 2 weeks of that later, Kevin either didn't show up for class or left early. I hope he found some other interests and that it was finally over. Not quite. I noticed Kevin was now following me to the bus station. It took just one time to see him standing inconspicuously behind the newspaper stand to freak out and call Steve as he lived nearby. Steve picked me up and drove me home. The next morning, Harper called me around 9 a.m. and went, "Are you in my class at 10 a.m. today?"
Yeah.
"Well, pack your stuff and wait for me at the end of your street. Kevin is waiting for you at the bus." Steve just called me. This went on for some 5 days as the guys extend their bro services to now accompanying me literally at all times before, during, and after class. Just to point out yet again, I am eternally grateful for it. These 4 dude brothers of mine were like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. All business and vengeance, and it was amazing and have probably saved me from a lot more problems with cute Kevin. That day, Kevin showed up to class looking somewhat roughed up, but now stared at me with so much hate I could barely cope. And finally, after some advice from Harper and Rick, decided to bring this stuff to college authorities. The pro dean immediately transferred Kevin to a completely different group so our classes never overlapped again. I stopped seeing Kevin all the time and reached my final year in college. By now, Zachary and Steve moved away. Harper finished it early and no longer attended classes, so it was only me and Rick now, but it was okay since Kevin was no longer there. I wish this was the end of it. Rick and I finished college, graduated, and decided to celebrate by visiting a medieval fair in Rick's hometown that summer. We agreed to get some drinks for old time's sake. Everything seemed fine at first. We were having a great time as we toured the fair. But then, suddenly, Rick, sweet, polite Rick, said, "No way, that can't be. Oh wait, it is." And there he was, Kevin. Cute Kevin standing there, staring at us. He quickly turned on his heels and walked away. We saw him a few more times after that. I started to panic, convinced he was following me again. Rick, sensing the same thing, quickly started dialing a few of his friends to come over. But then, just like that, Kevin disappeared. I never saw him again after that night. So, carry on, Kevin, you creepy little chicken. I hope by now you've learned how to function in society. It started with a radio broadcast. Late one night, as I drove down the desolate highway cutting through the desert, my car's radio crackled to life. I hadn't touched the dial. It had been silent for hours, nothing but static. But suddenly, a voice pushed through the interference. "If you can hear this, turn back." I frowned, glancing at the dashboard. The station read 89.9 FM. I didn't remember tuning into it. "Turn back now," the voice continued, warbled and distant, as if carried from another time. "You don't have much time." I reached for the dial to change the station, but as soon as I touched it, the voice became clearer. "They see you." A chill raced up my spine. I glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness behind me, the road stretching endlessly into the night. The desert was silent, empty. Yet, the feeling of being watched pressed against me like a physical weight. I turned off the radio. The silence was worse. A few miles ahead, the headlights caught something standing on the side of the road. A figure, tall, unmoving. Its features were obscured, swallowed by the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. As I approached, my headlights flickered. The figure remained still. I swerved around it, heart hammering, refusing to slow down. But just as I passed, my radio crackled back on. Too late. I looked in the mirror again, and my breath caught. The figure was no longer on the road. It was in my back seat. I don't remember much after that. My car skidded off the road, the world flipping end over end as metal screamed and glass shattered. When I woke, it was still dark. The car was totaled. My head pounding, blood dripping from my temple. The radio was still on. A new voice whispered through the static, soft and melodic. Not a warning this time, a greeting. Welcome back. We've been waiting for you. And as the static grew louder, the shadows outside my wrecked car began to move. I forced myself to breathe, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs. The radio continued its low, whispering murmur, shifting between voices, none of them familiar. Where am I? I mumbled, my throat dry, barely able to form words. The shadows swirled, elongating, shifting, creeping closer. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen was shattered, useless. The desert stretched in all directions, but the road was gone. Only empty sand remained. Then, the voice returned, calm and unhurried. You never left. I turned sharply, my heart threatening to burst. The figure was outside my car now, standing in the periphery of my broken headlights. It was watching. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its arms were too long, fingers too sharp. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It swayed slightly, as if adjusting to the stillness of the night. Who are you? My voice cracked. The radio crackled, its response distorted. You know us. I swallowed hard, my mind racing for any logical explanation. I had crashed, maybe I had hit my head too hard, maybe I was hallucinating, but the cold certainty in my gut told me otherwise. The figure moved, slow and deliberate. I tried to force my limbs to move, to crawl out of the wreckage, but my body wouldn't respond. The whispering voices in the radio grew louder, overlapping, growing into a chorus of distorted laughter and weeping. The figure raised a hand, and the shadows surged forward. Darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in my car. The engine was running. My hands gripped the wheel. The highway stretched ahead, the desert calm and quiet. The radio was silent. I glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m., the same time it had been when I first heard the broadcast. Had it all been a dream? I let out a shaky breath, then checked the rearview mirror. A figure stood on the roadside, watching as I drove past. The radio crackled. See you soon. For Christmas, my family, along with some family friends and their son, who was a good friend of mine, decided to stay at a hotel near a ski center. We hadn't seen snow in about 2 years since we live in Greece, where it's almost always hot. We were excited to finally experience it again. When we arrived, our parents told us that my friend and I would stay at the hotel, while they would stay in a house a few minutes away. This wasn't a problem for us. In fact, we felt freer and it was quieter. Plus, there were no other rooms left in the house with our parents, so everything seemed fine. We checked into the hotel and got the keys for our room. The hotel was small, with 3 entrances. One led to the cafeteria, which was a big door and locked most of the time, only being opened in the mornings for breakfast. The main entrance was always open, even at night. The third entrance was a small back door that remained open the entire time, leading directly to the rooms. What was even stranger was that the room doors couldn't be fully locked. Due to the messed up doorknobs, if you used enough force, you could push the door open even if it was locked. We were in room number 3, located on the first floor, part of a small hallway. The first 2 nights weren't too bad, though it wasn't as comfortable as being at home. took a little time to adjust, but overall, the hotel was fine and we didn't feel unsafe. There were other guests staying there, and our parents' house was only about 5 minutes away. However, on the third night, I had trouble sleeping. Around 5 a.m., I felt very uneasy, almost like I needed to protect my friend. I've known him for a long time, and I've always looked out for him, almost like a big brother. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and started scanning the room. I didn't notice anything at first, so I went to the bathroom. When I came back out, two things caught my attention. First, my friend had also woken up, and he seemed anxious. He mentioned he couldn't sleep either. Second, I noticed something strange. There were small mistletoe twigs scattered around the room. I remembered that the hotel staff had hung mistletoe on the doorknobs of each room for Christmas, but I never noticed our room looking like this before, especially since I had once forced the doorknob open when I'd accidentally left the keys inside while my friend was sleeping. Something about the mess of mistletoe didn't feel right, and it made me feel more uneasy. That kind of shook me at first, but I tried to remain calm and I just turned on the lights and started to talk to my friend about why he was also feeling anxious and at unease. He told me that he just couldn't sleep, and then he asked me something that creeps me out to this day. He asked me if I had stood up in the middle of the night and just looked down at him for a good 5 seconds before exiting the room for whatever reason so late. I didn't want to cause him any panics, so I just said, "Are you sure you didn't see that in your sleep? Because I never did that," and then proceeded to try to calm him down. Eventually, I did get him to calm down and got back to sleep, and I just put a chair close to the door and sat there on my phone till it became day and some light started showing through the curtains. I never mentioned anything because I didn't want to cause anyone to panic, because this could have just really been a very unfortunate combination of events. Also, we were scheduled to leave that morning either way, so I just held all this inside myself and didn't tell anyone. But who knows what could have happened if, when I opened my phone flashlight, someone was actually there. I've been an EMT for nearly 3 years now, working in Southern California. This story takes place when I was still fairly new to the job, just about 4 months in at a private ambulance company. We primarily handled basic life support, BLS, transports, taking patients who were under contract with various healthcare providers. However, every now and then we would get 911 calls from prisons. That's where this story starts. It was a late night at our station when I heard the familiar tone from my radio. Unit 221, priority response to state prison for an unknown medical emergency. Got it, wheels up in 2, I replied. I walked over to my partner, who was asleep on the couch in our break area. Rise and shine, someone's life is on the line, I said, a bit sarcastically. We climbed into the rig, fired up the engine, and headed out, lights flashing and sirens blaring. As we got closer to the prison, we turned off the sirens and lights for the security check. After a thorough search by the guards, we were granted access and parked outside the prison's medical bay. Gurney and medical gear in hand, we made our way into the facility. Since my partner had been the primary caregiver on the previous call, it was my turn to take the lead with this patient. Although I was still fairly new to being an EMT, I'd already had a fair share of prison transports. I'd encountered inmates who screamed at me, tried to bribe me, and even attempted to harm me. So, needless to say, I wasn't exactly looking for a confrontation at 4 a.m. on Unit 221. But I was always prepared for the worst. We were escorted by guards through the hospital's main area, which, like the rest of the facility, was set up more like a series of cells than a typical hospital. A nurse approached and handed me a sheet with the patient's information and recent vitals. I asked for the turnover report, the reason for the transport, and where we were headed. The nurse paused for a moment, then said, "You're taking him to Scripps Mercy Shores Hospital, room 329. He's going because he feels unwell and needs some tests. He shouldn't be an issue for you." Right away, something felt off. Scripps Mercy Shores is known for being a hospital for the wealthy. I had never heard of a prisoner being sent there, let alone for something as vague as not feeling well and needing tests. And what did he mean by, "he shouldn't be a problem for you"? If the patient was violent or high risk, they usually made that clear. Getting solid information about this patient's condition was like pulling teeth. I decided to go ahead with the transport, even though something didn't sit right with me. The prison guards led the shackled patient out to us, which in itself was strange. Normally, I would go in and speak with the inmate before getting them onto the gurney. But here stood a tall man, rather frail-looking, with a dark complexion. His eyes were hollow and red, and he appeared terrified. His body was shaking uncontrollably. He looked absolutely dreadful. I introduced myself and began my usual set of questions and checks. For the sake of the story, let's call him David. His answers came in a shaky, quiet voice. When I asked him what was wrong, he glanced nervously at the guards and the nurse before mumbling, "I don't feel well." His words sounded forced, almost like they had been rehearsed. My first thought was that he might have been abused by the staff, but I pushed that to the back of my mind for the time being. I decided to just get him on his way, and I'd handle the details once we were in the ambulance. Before helping him into the vehicle, I asked the same question I ask all my inmate patients. Be honest with me, and I'll be honest with you. Are you going to cause any trouble once we're on the road? He quickly shook his head, signaling no, and we were off. When transporting prisoners, one guard always accompanies us in the ambulance, while another follows in what's called a tail car for security. This is done to ensure that if the patient tries anything, an official can respond immediately. I was busy working on my report when I realized that, in the chaos of the call and the late hour, I had forgotten to take David's vitals. Classic rookie mistake. We were about halfway to the hospital, and the entire time he had been eerily quiet. I told him I was going to check his vitals and asked him to give me his arm. He complied immediately, almost as if he had been conditioned to obey without question. That same terrified expression was still on his face. I wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm, and that's when I first felt it. His skin was ice cold. There was absolutely no warmth to his body at all. I asked him if he wanted a blanket, but he declined. Continuing with the exam, I inflated the cuff and placed my stethoscope over his brachial artery, waiting to hear his pulse. But it never came back. I thought it was a problem with my stethoscope, so I grabbed a backup one, but the result was the same, no pulse. I removed the equipment and tried feeling for his pulse directly, but there was nothing. I looked at him and asked if he was feeling all right. He quietly answered, "I'm okay, thank you." Caught off guard, I grabbed the pulse oximeter, which measures heart rate and blood oxygen levels, and placed it on his finger. After a few seconds, the machine displayed a heart rate of 0 and blood oxygen levels at 0. My heart sank as I checked the vitals again, hoping I had misread something, but everything was the same: heart rate, 0. Blood pressure, 0. Blood oxygen level, 0. The only consistent reading was his respiratory rate, which was 24 breaths per minute. It was slightly higher than normal, but not alarming on its own. I looked at him again and asked if he was okay. He met my gaze, nodded, and said, "Yes," as tears started to form in his eyes. Then, without another word, he looked away. He was fully aware of everything going on around him. He answered every question without hesitation. His pupils were reactive and equal signs of a functioning brain. But there was absolutely no pulse, no sign of vascular activity. At this point, I didn't know what to make of the situation. From a scientific standpoint, there was no way he should be alive. Even with an artificial heart, he would still show some vital signs, and there would be a battery pack and a filter kit visible. But here he was, alert, breathing, talking to me. Nothing added up. I kept on with my examination. I used my stethoscope to listen to his heart. Nothing. No beat, no thumping, just the sound of his breath filling the air. I checked his lungs next, normal, clear. I had just finished when we arrived at the hospital. We unloaded him, took him to the room as instructed, and he somehow managed to hop off the gurney and walk to the bed with the guards escorting him. I started relaying the details of the situation to the nurse, who, oddly, didn't seem shocked by any of it. After finishing up the report, I sat down in a nearby chair to finish mine. While typing, I was interrupted by the sound of a hospital gurney rolling down the hall. For people in surgical gowns entered the room where the inmate had been taken. A few minutes later, the team came out. The inmate was strapped down to a gurney, restrained, and crying. They wheeled him away, rounding the corner. That was the last I saw of him. I told my partner about what had happened once we were back in the ambulance. At first, he didn't believe me, which was understandable. I joke around a lot, but the look I gave him made him realize I wasn't kidding. This story might not be what you expected. There's no violence, no intense scares. But this was by far the most unsettling call I've ever had. I still don't know what I saw or who I transported. I have my theories, like experimental treatments being tested on inmates, but with his skin like ice, no vital signs, and that fearful expression, I can't help but wonder what kind of experiments or horrors he had endured. Something strange happened to me recently, something I can't quite wrap my mind around. It's left me confused and, to be honest, a little creeped out. I live in a small village in the west of Ireland, not far from the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. With around 25,100 people in the area, it's a tight-knit community. In a place this small, you know pretty much everyone, or at least recognize their faces. There was a man named Jimmy from town, now deceased, who used to come into the pub I worked at quite often. We'd have chats regularly. In more recent years, I did some training at the local nursing home, where Jimmy was a full-time resident. Jimmy had Alzheimer's and was under constant supervision. Though his memory was nearly gone, he never lost his knack for playing cards. During my training, I'd spend time with him playing cards, though I lost nearly every game. While that might seem insignificant, it's actually important to what I'm about to tell you. Jimmy has since passed away and is buried in the local cemetery, which is attached to the church. In the evenings, I take my dogs for walks, and one of my usual routes is through the church grounds and across the cemetery. The cemetery sits on a gradual slope, offering a lovely view of the village and the valley. All the graves are arranged in rows, as you'd expect. My dogs, both Jack Russell Terriers, are typically fearless and get excited for walks, but they're never easily spooked. Last week, I decided to take my usual route through the graveyard, but when we reached the gate, I noticed something unusual. Both dogs, who had been wagging their tails and clearly looking forward to the walk, suddenly stopped. Their tails went between their legs, and their heads lowered as if they were hesitant to go any further. I didn't think much of it at the time and jokingly pulled them through the gate, scolding them lightly, asking in that familiar Irish way, "What's wrong with you?" We continued up the slope, passing the graves along the way. Some names were familiar while others were not. Nothing strange, just the usual. Normally, when I reached the last grave on the slope, I'd pass by Jimmy's grave. I would always stop briefly and think to myself, "How are you, Jimmy?" As a quality manager, I tend to notice the little details, and I knew for certain that Jimmy's grave was the last one on the slope, right there in the front row. I passed it at least once a week since he passed, and I knew without question where it was. But on this particular evening, as the dogs and I reached the end of the slope, my heart nearly stopped. Jimmy's grave was gone. I couldn't understand it. A completely different gravestone stood there of a woman who I also knew from the locale. But how could this be? Jimmy's grave was definitely there. My eyes started darting from grave to grave looking for Jimmy's grave in despair. I eventually found it 3 or 4 rows back, but nowhere near the top front row where I had seen it before so many times. Miffed about what had just happened, an uneasy feeling came over me and the hairs began to stand on the back of my neck. Maybe I too was sensing what the dogs had felt earlier. I noticed the breeze had disappeared and the cemetery was eerily silent, as you could normally hear birdsong from the surrounding trees. I couldn't get out of there fast enough that evening. I have since passed through the cemetery, and still Jimmy's grave is still in the mix with all the others, completely out of place of where I know it used to be. I really cannot understand what happened. It's not as if they moved his plot or that many people have been buried since he was. Reflecting upon this story, I recalled something that happened to me a few years earlier in that cemetery. Every July on the last Sunday of the month, the local priest holds a ceremony called the Blessing of the Graves. As my grandparents are buried there, I would normally attend such an event, not so much for the religious aspect, but just to catch up with my relatives who would attend. Last year, I wasn't feeling well on this Sunday, so I actually missed the ceremony. Feeling a little guilty about this, I decided in my free time to go to the grave to maybe say a quiet prayer for my grandparents. I have been to the grave many times as I often help my mother maintain it by weeding and decorating it with flowers, as well as the annual visit for the blessing of the graves. But this particular day, I could not find the grave and I spent a good 20 minutes looking for it. Blaming myself, I just put it down to my own ignorance as to why I couldn't find it. But now in hindsight, I wonder if instead of my ignorance, was there something a little more sinister and paranormal at play? For years ago, I had an RV that I used for camping in the woods behind my house. It wasn't anything special, it was an old, beat-up thing, but I didn't need anything fancy. I'd drive it a couple miles into the woods, park, and set up camp for a few days. I went out a lot, but it wasn't always with friends, since not everyone could take a few days off. This particular weekend, I went out alone. I drove the RV a mile down a dirt road, pulled off into a small clearing surrounded by trees, and set up camp. I built a small fire, set out some chairs, and just relaxed with a few drinks. The goal was always to unwind and enjoy the solitude. As the night began to fall, I added more wood to the fire. Shortly after the sun had completely set, I started hearing something moving around outside my camp. It didn't sound like animals. It sounded more like someone walking through the trees, just outside the firelight. I looked around but didn't see anyone. The footsteps continued for about 20 minutes, circling my camp, but I couldn't make out anything. I decided to put out the fire and head into the RV, locking the doors for the night. I kept checking the windows, hoping to see something or anyone, but nothing ever appeared. This wasn't a normal experience, especially since I'd camped out in these woods many times and never once had anyone come near my camp. The fact that someone was out there in the dark without a flashlight made it even more unsettling. I double-checked the locks before heading to bed, and thankfully, I managed to sleep through the night. In the morning, I made coffee, had breakfast, and spent a couple hours in the RV before stepping outside. I was considering taking a hike around the area, but I didn't feel comfortable leaving the RV unattended with someone potentially still out there. So I opted for a short walk instead. I went to the area where I'd heard the footsteps the night before, hoping to find shoe prints or any sign of who might have been there. But after a quick search, I didn't find anything useful. It didn't help my nerves, and when I got back to the RV, I strapped my handgun to my waist, just to be safe. When night fell again, I started the fire, trying to distract myself. I sat outside for about an hour, relieved that I hadn't heard anything. I had a beer and listened to the peaceful sounds of the woods, gradually starting to feel a bit more at ease. But as I stood to put out the fire, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, and there, about 25 feet away, stood a figure between the trees. They were faintly illuminated by the firelight, just staring at me. After a brief moment, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The silence that followed only added to my unease. I didn't hear any more footsteps or movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there. I quickly gathered my things and put them inside the RV, then put out the fire and locked myself in again. I thought about leaving the next morning, but part of me wanted to stay just to make sure nothing else happened. Whoever was out there had now approached my camp twice, never saying a word or introducing themselves. I stayed vigilant, checking the windows every few minutes and listening for any sounds. It wasn't until the third hour, when I was starting to doze off in my chair, that I heard footsteps again, this time fast and heading straight for the RV. I froze, holding my pistol, hoping they wouldn't try anything. There was a few seconds of silence, like they were standing right outside the door, not moving. Then I heard them walking slowly around the RV, only to suddenly run off into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night, wide awake, until the sun finally came up. As soon as it was light enough to drive, I packed up and left. Whoever was out there clearly had something sinister in mind, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what. I wasn't going to risk it being me who didn't make it out. The first time I caught him staring, I tried to dismiss it as a coincidence. The second time, I told myself he was just being friendly. But by the third time, when I found my favorite mug in the wrong cabinet, I knew something was seriously off about the man who had moved in next door. It all began on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the scent of fallen leaves filled the air and the possibilities of the day seemed endless. I was hauling groceries up to my third-floor apartment when I first saw him. He was standing in the doorway of the unit across the hall, watching me struggle with my bags. I gave him a polite smile, which he returned after a moment's hesitation. "Just moved in?" I asked, trying to get my keys out of my bag. He nodded, his eyes locked on mine. "Yesterday," he replied, and then added, "I'm Michael. Nice to meet you, Michael." "I'm Emma," I said as I finally managed to open my door. "Welcome to the building." He just stood there, staring at me until I closed the door behind me. I thought it was just social awkwardness, nothing more, and moved on. But over the next few weeks, I kept running into Michael. He always seemed to be in the hallway when I left for work or came home. At first, I tried to engage in small talk about the weather or complained about the temperamental elevator, but his responses were always brief. His gaze was intense, never wavering. Then I started noticing him outside the building. I'd catch glimpses of him across the street when I went for my morning run, or at the coffee shop where I worked on my laptop during the weekends. Once, I even saw him at the grocery store, lurking at the end of the aisle as I picked out cereal. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. After all, New York was a big city, but neighborhoods could feel small. It was probably just coincidence that we kept crossing paths. Besides, Michael hadn't done anything overtly threatening. He was just there, always there. But then things in my apartment started to change. It started with small things: a book out of place on the shelf, a window that I could have sworn I closed left open by an inch. I blamed it on my own absent-mindedness, on the stress of my job, and the late nights working on a big project. But the mug was what finally convinced me something was wrong. It was my favorite, a handmade pottery piece my sister had given me for my birthday. I always kept it in the cabinet right above the coffee maker. But one morning, when I opened that cabinet, it was gone. I found it 2 cabinets over, tucked between plates I hardly ever used. My hands shook as I made my coffee. There was no way I could have put it there. No way I could have been that distracted, which meant someone else had been in my apartment. And deep down, I had a sinking feeling I knew who it was. I started taking precautions. I changed the locks, installed a security camera in my living room, and asked the building manager to check if anyone had requested access to my apartment. She assured me no one had, but that uneasy feeling in my stomach never went away. The camera footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, but items kept moving around my apartment. My throw pillows would be arranged differently when I came home. The books on my nightstand would be in a new order. Once, I even found a shirt I'd never seen before mixed in with my laundry. I became a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. I started staying late at work, dreading the moment I'd have to return home. My friends noticed the change in me, but how could I explain? I had no proof, just a growing certainty that my neighbor was somehow getting into my apartment and moving things around, watching me sleep. The possibilities were terrifying. One night, about 2 months after Michael had moved in, I woke up to a noise in my living room. My heart leaped into my throat as I lay there, ears straining in the darkness. There it was again, a soft, shuffling sound like someone trying to move quietly across my hardwood floors. I reached for my phone with trembling hands, ready to call 911. But as my fingers touched the screen, a shadow fell across my bedroom doorway. I froze, hardly daring to breathe to Emma. Michael's voice was soft, almost gentle. "I know you're awake." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying this was just a nightmare. But when I opened them again, he was still there, a dark silhouette against the faint light from the living room. "How did you get in here?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. He chuckled, a low sound that sent chills down my spine. I've always been here, Emma. You just didn't notice me before. He took a step into the room, and I scrambled back against my headboard. Stay away from me, I yelled, finally finding my voice. I'm calling the police. No, you're not, he said calmly, and to my horror, I saw my phone in his hand. I didn't want it to be like this, Emma. I wanted you to invite me in willingly, but you're making things so difficult. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. The window was too high to jump, and he was blocking the only door. I was trapped. What do you want from me? I asked, trying to keep him talking while I looked for something, anything I could use as a weapon. Michael took another step closer, and in the dim light, I could see his face. His eyes were wide, feverish, his smile too wide and full of teeth. I want us to be together, Emma. I've watched you for so long. I know everything about you. Your hopes, your fears, your dreams were perfect for each other. Can't you see that? I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. You don't know me. You're sick, Michael. You need help. His face darkened, the smile twisting into something ugly. I'm not sick, he snarled. I love you. Why can't you understand that? He lunged forward, hands outstretched. I screamed and rolled off the bed, narrowly avoiding his grasp. I ran for the door, but he was faster, grabbing my arm and yanking me back. We struggled, crashing into my dresser. I felt something sharp against my hand and grabbed it without thinking. Pair of scissors I'd left out. I swung blindly, feeling the blade connect with something soft. Michael let out a howl of pain and stumbled back. I didn't wait to see how badly I'd hurt him. I ran out of the bedroom, through the living room, and into the hallway. I pounded on doors, screaming for help. Lights came on, doors opened. My neighbors emerged, confused and alarmed. Someone was calling the police. I collapsed in the hallway, shaking and sobbing. The police arrived quickly. They found Michael in my apartment, bleeding from a cut on his arm. As they led him away in handcuffs, he kept calling my name, telling me he loved me, that we were meant to be together. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and victim support services. I learned that Michael had been stalking women for years, moving from city to city when things got too hot. He'd chosen me as his latest obsession, but I was the first to fight back. I couldn't stay in that apartment after what happened. I moved, changed jobs, even changed my name, but the fear lingered. For months, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I could hear footsteps in my living room. I'd check and double-check my locks, jump at unexpected noises, and flinch when strangers got too close. It's been 2 years now. I'm doing better, thanks to therapy and a support group for survivors of stalking. But I'll never forget the terror of that night. The feeling of violation knowing someone had been in my space, watching me when I thought I was alone. Sometimes, when I'm walking down the street or sitting in a cafe, I'll catch someone looking at me. It's probably innocent, just a curious glance or a friendly smile. But for a moment, I'm back in that apartment with Michael's eyes boring into me. And I'll hurry home, lock my doors, and remind myself that I'm safe now, that he can't hurt me anymore. But late at night, in the quiet darkness of my new apartment, I still wonder, how long had he really been watching me? How much did he see? And most chillingly of all, is there someone else out there watching me even now, waiting for their chance to make me their obsession? The click of a camera shutter can capture a moment of beauty, but it can also seal your fate. I never imagined that my passion for wildlife photography would thrust me into a deadly game of cat and mouse with armed poachers in the heart of a national park. It was meant to be the trip of a lifetime. I had saved for years to embark on a solo photography expedition to South Africa's Kruger National Park. As a wildlife enthusiast and amateur photographer, the opportunity to capture the big five in their natural habitat was a dream come true. The first few days were nothing short of magical. I had managed to photograph elephants bathing in a watering hole, a pride of lions basking in the afternoon sun, and even a pair of elusive leopards. With each click of my camera, I felt as though I was preserving a piece of untamed Africa. On the fourth day, I decided to venture into a more remote part of the park. My guide, Themba, a local, had told me about a hidden spot where rhinos often gathered at dusk. The chance to photograph these endangered creatures was too rare to pass up. We set off in the late afternoon, bumping along dusty trails rarely traveled by tourists. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the savannah in warm, golden hues, Themba brought the jeep to a stop. "We'll go on foot from here," he whispered, his eyes scanning the landscape. "Remember absolute silence. Rhinos have poor eyesight, but their hearing is excellent." I nodded, shouldering my camera bag. We crept through the bush, the dry grass crunching softly beneath our feet. After about 15 minutes, Themba raised a hand, signaling for me to stop. He pointed silently, and my heart raced. There, about 100 yards away, was a group of white rhinos. Their massive gray bodies stood out against the golden grass. Their horns were silhouetted against the setting sun. It was a photographer's dream. I raised my camera, adjusting the settings with trembling hands. Just as I was about to take the shot, a sharp crack echoed across the plain. It sounded like a gunshot. The rhinos scattered, disappearing into the brush with surprising speed for such large creatures. Themba grabbed my arm, his face etched with concern. "Poachers," he hissed. "We need to leave now." But curiosity and a misplaced sense of duty overrode my common sense. "We should report this," I whispered back, "if we can get evidence." Themba shook his head vehemently, but I was already moving, creeping towards where the sound had come from. Reluctantly, he followed. As we neared a small clearing, I heard voices, men speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I peered around a large acacia tree and felt my blood run cold. For men stood in the clearing, armed with high-powered rifles, but it was what lay at their feet that made my stomach churn. A rhino, its magnificent horn brutally hacked off, blood staining the dusty ground. Without thinking, I raised my camera and started shooting. The rapid-fire click of the shutter seemed deafening in the tense silence. One of the men's heads snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. Then all hell broke loose. "Run!" Themba yelled, grabbing my arm and yanking me away. We crashed through the bush, thorns tearing at our clothes, branches whipping our faces. Behind us, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Themba was a few paces ahead, his knowledge of the terrain our only advantage. A gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering bark off a tree inches from my head. I ducked instinctively, nearly losing my footing. "Keep going," Themba urged, his voice strained. We ran for what felt like hours, the sounds of pursuit sometimes fading, sometimes growing alarmingly close. As darkness fell, the bush became a maze of shadows, every sound amplified by our fear. Finally, Themba pulled me into a small cave formed by an overhanging rock. We crouched there, our breathing ragged, straining to hear any sign of the poachers. "What do we do now?" I whispered once I'd caught my breath. Themba's face was grim in the dim light. "But we wait. The park rangers will be looking for us by now. But so are the poachers if they find us first." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The night stretched on endlessly. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us tense, expecting to see the barrel of a gun appear at any moment. I clutched my camera, the evidence it contained now a dangerous burden. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we heard a new sound, the distant whir of helicopter blades. Hope surged through me, but Themba remained cautious. "Could be a park ranger chopper," he whispered. "Or it could be the poachers, buyers coming to collect the horn. We can't risk moving until we're sure." So we waited, the sound growing louder, then fading, then returning. It was maddening, not knowing if it heralded rescue or doom. Suddenly, a voice crackled through a megaphone, barely audible, but unmistakably speaking English. "This is Kruger Park Rangers. If you can hear this, signal your location." Relief flooded through me, but Themba held me back. "Wait," he cautioned. could be a trick. But as the voice repeated the message, this time mentioning my name and Themba's, we knew it was genuine. We stumbled out of our hiding place, waving our arms frantically. The helicopter spotted us quickly, landing in a nearby clearing, as rangers poured out, rifles at the ready, scanning the area for threats. I felt my knees go weak. It was over. We were safe. The debriefing at park headquarters was intense. I handed over my camera. The photos I had taken now crucial evidence in the fight against poaching. The park director, a stern-faced woman named Miriam, looked at me with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You took an incredibly foolish risk," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But these photos, they could make a real difference. We've suspected for some time that there was a large-scale poaching operation in the park, but we've never had solid evidence until now." In the days that followed, as I gave statements to police and park officials, the full scope of what I had stumbled upon became clear. The poachers were part of a sophisticated international syndicate, with connections reaching into high levels of government and business. My photos, along with Themba's testimony, provided the missing link the authorities needed to launch a major operation. Within weeks, arrests were made, not just of the poachers we had seen, but of corrupt officials and wealthy buyers as well. As for me, I found myself thrust into the spotlight, hailed as a hero by conservation groups. Journalists wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers sought my story. It was overwhelming and, if I'm honest, a little frightening. A little. The poaching syndicate had long arms, and there was always the nagging fear of retaliation. But more than that, I struggled with the knowledge of what my actions had set in motion. Yes, dangerous criminals had been caught, and perhaps some rhinos would be saved. But I also knew that for every poacher arrested, there were desperate people waiting to take their place, driven by poverty and lack of opportunity. The experience changed me profoundly. I couldn't go back to being just an amateur photographer, not after what I had witnessed. I began working with wildlife conservation groups, using my images to raise awareness about the devastating effects of poaching. A year later, I returned to Kruger, but this time, it was as part of an anti-poaching education initiative. The park felt different now. Still beautiful, still wild, but there was an underlying vulnerability that I hadn't noticed before. Themba had been promoted to head ranger, his bravery and quick thinking during our ordeal recognized by the park management. When we met again, there was a connection between us that went beyond words, forged in the terrifying hours we spent fleeing and hiding. As we stood together, watching the sunset over the savannah with a family of rhinos grazing peacefully in the distance, Themba turned to me with a smile. "You know," he said, "most people come to Africa to shoot animals with their cameras. You managed to shoot down an entire poaching ring." I laughed, but it was a laugh laden with the weight of everything that had happened. My camera hung by my side, a constant reminder of the power and responsibility that came with being a witness to the world. The African bush stretched out before us, beautiful, dangerous, full of vibrant life and ever-present death. I raised my camera, focusing on the rhinos, mesmerized by their ancient silhouettes against the deep red sky. As I pressed the shutter, the familiar click resonated with new meaning. Each photo was no longer just an image. It was a testament, a call to action, a reminder of what was at stake in the fight to preserve the wild places and creatures of our world. The light faded, and darkness crept across the land. But in that moment, standing beside a friend who had become a brother, watching over the rhinos, I felt a fierce sense of hope. Yes, the night was full of dangers, but the dawn would come, and we would be there to greet it, cameras in hand, ready to capture and protect the wild heart of Africa. Two New Years ago, I came dangerously close to being assaulted. I had been invited to a party hosted by a friend of my older brother. Since it was a last-minute invitation and I couldn't find a date to go with me, I was hesitant to attend. However, after much pressure from my brother, I agreed to go, on the condition that he accompany me. I made it clear that I didn't go to parties with alcohol without a male escort. This was because I had seen what happened to some of my female friends in college, and I didn't want to take any chances. I didn't explicitly tell my brother this, but I think he understood. I didn't want it to feel like a date. I just felt safer with a guy around to watch my back. My brother finally agreed, and he picked me up around 8:30 p.m. At the party, there were a few people I knew, so I stayed near them as much as possible. However, the only other girl there wasn't the best company. Her conversational skills were limited to shoes and reality TV. Before we arrived, I made my brother promise to stay within sight of me so I could signal him if I wanted to leave or needed help. After a little resistance, he agreed and we headed inside. The party had an open bar, so by 10:30, most of the guests were already heavily intoxicated. On one of my trips to the bar, I had to deal with a sleazy guy hitting on me, and throughout the night, people kept bumping into me. This was probably when someone spiked my drink. The rest of the night is mostly a blur. I remember lying on a couch in another room, but the rest of the events were told to me the next day. Apparently, at some point before midnight, I vanished, and my brother had to search for me. He asked several people if they'd seen where I went, but no one, except the girl I had been talking to, knew. She told him that when she last spoke to me, I was severely drunk, telling her to F off before stumbling out of the room. My brother knew I never got out of control like that, so something was clearly wrong. After searching a closet in the adjoining ballroom, he checked a small waiting area opposite the ballroom and found me unconscious on a couch. The terrifying part was that when he arrived, he caught a man trying to take off my underpants. The creep had my skirt hiked up and was reaching for my panties when my brother pulled him off me. As a protective older brother, he beat the guy up so badly that he lost a few teeth. Once he was done with him, he threw me over his shoulder and carried me to the car. It wasn't until the following afternoon that I could stay awake. Despite this, I was barely able to do so and felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My brother's freaked out behavior told me without saying anything that something really bad had happened the night before. And when he told me what it was, I was unable to speak. From that day on, I swore off going to parties or anywhere alcohol was being served. I tried my best to move past it, but I realized after another unrelated incident, which I won't mention, I needed counseling. I have a way to go before I'll be able to be intimate with anyone, and I have no intention in rushing my recovery. Probably the only man I still trust is my brother. A week still doesn't go by that I don't thank him for saving me. No doubt, some people will wonder why my brother didn't take me to the hospital. What he's told me was that at the time, he wasn't sure if I'd been drugged or was just very intoxicated. He also knew that the police would be contacted, and since he had just beat my assailant almost to death, and I'm not being dramatic, he was afraid he may be charged with something. He was willing to wager that the guy wasn't going to go to the cops. After all, what was he going to say? Since we never heard from the police, I guess he was right. Now that my brother had seen what some guys would do to get what they want, he's much more understanding of my earlier fears and those of his female friends. He's become the unelected sheriff and protector of all the girls, and since he whipped that dude so badly, no more incidents such as mine have occurred anywhere he's in attendance. I couldn't be more proud of him or love him anymore. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. The usual chorus of birds singing, a comforting sound that filled our mornings in the wilderness, was completely absent. I unzipped the tent and peeked outside into the misty dawn, and that's when the unsettling feeling crept over me. Something was off, something felt wrong. We had been camping for 3 days now, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Mia, and me. It was supposed to be a week-long trip, a chance to disconnect and enjoy nature. But as I scanned the campsite, my blood ran cold. Carved into the trunks of every tree surrounding our clearing were strange symbols. Detailed, alien-like designs that seemed to glow faintly in the dim morning light. They formed a perfect circle around our camp, a barrier that hadn't been there when we went to bed. "Jake," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Jake, you need to see this." I heard rustling inside the tent, followed by Jake's groggy voice. "What's up, man? It's barely dawn. Just come out here, please." A few moments later, Jake emerged from the tent, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. When he saw the symbols, he froze, his face draining of color. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. By then, Mia had joined us, her eyes wide as she took in the bizarre sight. Did you guys do this?" she asked, her voice shaky. I shook my head, my heart pounding. "No way. These weren't here last night. Someone or something must have done this while we were asleep." We stood there in stunned silence, the weight of what that meant starting to sink in. Someone or something had been in our camp, just feet away from where we slept, carving these strange symbols into the trees. And we hadn't heard a thing. Jake was the first to shake it off. "Okay, let's not panic. Maybe it's just some local kids messing around. We should pack up and head back to the trailhead." I nodded, grateful for his level-headedness. We moved quickly to break down camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, the eerie symbols making the back of my neck prickle. The longer I stared at them, the more they seemed to twist in my mind, the intricate patterns making my head throb. It wasn't until we were almost done packing that we realized the true horror of our situation. Jake had gone to retrieve our bear bag, the sack containing all of our food, which we had hung high in a tree to keep it safe from wildlife. He returned empty-handed, his face ashen. "The rope's been cut," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "All our food is gone." Mia gasped. "But that's impossible. The noise would have woken us up." I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever or whatever had done this wasn't just playing a prank. They had deliberately cut off our food supply. Maybe we missed a cache on the map, I suggested, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "There might be emergency supplies at one of the ranger stations." Jake nodded, pulling out our map. But as he unfolded it, his expression changed from hopeful to confused, then to outright fear. This isn't right." I looked over his shoulder and felt my stomach drop. The map was the same one we'd been using for the past 3 days. But now it was covered in the same strange symbols that surrounded our camp. The trails, landmarks, everything had been obscured by the alien script. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's not freak out. We know the general direction of the trailhead. If we just head east, we're bound to hit a road eventually." We shouldered our packs and set off, trying to maintain a brave face. But as we walked, it quickly became apparent that something was very wrong. The forest looked different somehow. The trees seemed taller, more densely packed. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't. And more than once, I could have sworn I saw shapes darting just at the edge of my vision. Hours passed, and we should have reached the trailhead by now. But the forest showed no signs of thinning, no indication that we were nearing civilization. Our water was running low, and hunger was beginning to gnaw at us. "We need to stop and reassess," Jake said finally, his voice tight with stress. We found a small clearing and dropped our packs. As Mia rationed out our remaining water, I climbed a tall tree, hoping to get a better view of our surroundings. What I saw from the top made my heart sink. Forest stretched in every direction, unbroken by roads or clearings. And worse, I could see more of those symbols carved into trees in the distance, forming concentric circles around us. We weren't getting out. We were being herded deeper in. When I relayed this to Jake and Mia, the last vestiges of hope seemed to drain from their faces. "What do they want from us?" Mia asked, her voice small and frightened. Before anyone could answer, a twig snapped in the forest behind us. We whirled around, peering into the gathering darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin seemed to shift and ripple, like static on an old TV. And carved into its flesh were the same symbols that surrounded us. We ran. Blind panic propelled us through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. I could hear something moving behind us, keeping pace but never quite catching up. Night fell quickly, plunging the forest into an inky blackness that our flashlights could barely penetrate. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing in a small hollow formed by the roots of a massive tree. As we lay there, gasping for breath, reality began to set in. We were lost in a forest that defied logic, being hunted by something beyond our understanding, with no food and dwindling water. The gravity of our situation hit me like a physical blow. "What do we do now?" Mia whispered, clutching Jake's hand. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could I say? That we were going to be okay? That we'd find a way out? Any reassurance would have rung hollow in the face of our impossible situation. A sound cut through the night, a low, melodic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air around us began to shimmer, and those damn cymbals reappeared, floating in the air like holographic projections. "Oh God!" Jake breathed, his voice full of dread. "They're coming." The humming grew louder, accompanied by a strange pressure in my head, as if something was trying to force its way inside my mind. I saw Jake and Mia clutching their heads, their faces contorted with pain. Then, images began to flash before my eyes. Vast, impossible structures on alien worlds, and creatures that defied all logic, moving through dimensions I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And amidst it all, those symbols, pulsing and shifting, their meaning just beyond my reach. I don't know how long we were trapped in that nightmarish vision, overwhelmed by things no human should ever witness. Could have been minutes or hours, but eventually, mercifully, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, the forest was gone. We weren't lying on the ground anymore. Instead, we were sprawled on cold, smooth stone, in an immense chamber that seemed to stretch endlessly. The walls, floor, and ceiling were covered in those symbols, glowing softly with an inner light. And we weren't alone. Surrounding us were the creatures, dozens of them, twisting and shifting in ways that made my mind reel. They didn't approach us. They just watched with eyes that weren't really eyes. One of them stepped forward, its form shifting into something almost human, but not quite. When it spoke, the words didn't come from its mouth. They appeared directly in my mind. "You have been chosen," it said, "to witness, to understand, to become." I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, no longer responding to my commands. "Your world is but one of many," the creature continued. "Your reality, a thin veil easily pierced. We are the Watchers, the keepers of gates, and you shall join us." As it spoke, I felt my body begin to change. My skin rippled, twisted, and new appendages sprouted where none should have been. I tried to scream, but my mouth was no longer a mouth. The last thing I saw before everything shifted was Jake and Mia, both undergoing the same horrific transformation. Then the world changed. I was seeing, feeling, and experiencing reality in a way I couldn't have ever imagined. We had entered the forest as humans. We would leave it as something else entirely. The Watchers had chosen us, and in doing so had erased our humanity. In the world we left behind, 3 more hikers would disappear in those same woods. Search parties would find nothing but strange symbols carved into trees, and the forest would wait, patient and hungry, for its next victims. For we were the Watchers now, and the hunt would continue. The first whisper caught me off guard, barely louder than the hum of the old computer. I shrugged it off as a product of my imagination, a trick of the mind in the dead of night in the empty building. But when the footsteps began, echoing through the hallways and growing louder with each passing second, a cold certainty settled in my gut. I was no longer alone in the abandoned computer lab. It was supposed to be just another all-nighter, like every college student does at least once a semester. My thesis was due in under 48 hours, and I was nowhere near finished. The quiet solitude of the computer science building at 2 a.m. seemed like the perfect place to focus and churn out the last few pages. I'd spent countless late nights there before, always by myself, always uninterrupted. Bob, the night janitor, usually made his rounds around midnight. We'd exchange a brief nod, but he never bothered me. Tonight, however, everything felt off. The shadows seemed darker, the silence suffocating. I tried to keep my focus on the screen, the rhythmic tapping of the keys the only sound breaking the stillness. But as the hours dragged on, the creeping sensation that something, or someone, was watching me wouldn't leave. It started with small things. A flicker in the corner of my vision, gone when I turned to look. A chill that ran up my spine as I felt a breath on the back of my neck, despite being alone in the room. I dismissed it as exhaustion and too much caffeine, forcing myself to keep typing. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was so faint at first that I thought it was just the wind outside. But then it came again, louder this time, in a voice that made my skin prickle. I spun around in my chair, heart hammering in my chest. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnervingly loud in the quiet lab. "Is someone there?" There was no reply, only the soft hum of computers and the distant buzz of the fluorescent lights above. I turned back to the screen, trying to calm my erratic heartbeat. "Get a grip," I told myself. "It's just your imagination." But then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside. These weren't Bob's usual shuffling sneakers. These steps were sharp, rhythmic, and echoed on the linoleum floor. I froze, fingers suspended over the keyboard. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped right outside the lab door. I held my breath. The door handle turned slowly, the old hinges creaking as it inched open. I spun around, expecting a security guard or perhaps another student, but there was nothing. The doorway stood open, revealing nothing but the dark hallway beyond. "Hello," I called again, my voice trembling. "This isn't funny. Who's there?" And then the whispers began again, only now they were coming from all directions. They seemed to seep from the walls themselves, a jumbled chorus of unintelligible murmurs that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood, my legs shaky, the terror growing in my chest. This was insane. I needed to get out of here, thesis be damned. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door, only to stop short as the whispers suddenly ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from somewhere deep within the building came a scream. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound of pure terror and agony that echoed through the empty halls. I ran out of the lab down the hallway, my footsteps thundering in the silence that followed the scream. I reached the stairwell and took the steps two at a time, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I reached the ground floor, I heard the click-clack of those footsteps again, this time from the floor above. They were moving fast, too fast, racing down the stairs behind me. I burst through the exit door, expecting to feel the cool night air on my face. Instead, I found myself in another hallway, identical to the one I just left. Confusion and panic warred within me. This was impossible. I knew this building like the back of my hand. The exit should have led outside. The footsteps were getting closer. I picked a direction at random and ran, passing door after door, all of them locked. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the fluorescent lights above flickering ominously. Finally, I saw a door marked exit at the end of the hall. Relief flooded through me as I sprinted towards it. I grabbed the handle, turned it, and nothing. It was locked. No, 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 I muttered, yanking on the handle desperately. This couldn't be happening. The click-clack of footsteps stopped right behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting to turn around, not wanting to see what had been chasing me. "Open your eyes, Michael," a voice said, soft and melodious. It was somehow familiar, though I knew I'd never heard it before. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned and opened my eyes. The figure before me was impossible. It shifted and changed as I looked at it, never settling on a single form. One moment it was tall and spindly with too many limbs. The next it was short and squat, its skin rippling like water. Its face, if you could call it that, was a swirling mass of features, eyes and mouths appearing and disappearing in a dizzying dance. "What are you?" I stammered, pressing myself against the locked door. The being's current mouth curved into a smile. "We are the Watchers," it said, its voice now a chorus of whispers. "We have always been here in the spaces between, watching, waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "For someone to see us," it replied. for someone to believe. As it spoke, the hallway around us began to shift and warp. The walls melted away, revealing a vast star-filled void. I felt myself starting to float, untethered from reality. You've spent so many nights here, Michael, the being continued, so close to the threshold. We've been trying to reach you to show you the truth. Memories flashed through my mind. All those nights I'd spent alone in the lab, the odd sensations I'd dismissed, the fleeting glimpses of something just beyond my perception. What truth? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The being's form settled briefly into something almost human, that your world is just one layer of many, that there are wonders and terrors beyond your wildest imagination just waiting to be discovered. As it spoke, visions flooded my mind. I saw impossible cities built in the spaces between stars, creatures that defied description roaming through dimensions I couldn't comprehend. I saw the history of the universe unfold in an instant and glimpsed futures that left me breathless with awe and terror. Why me? I managed to ask, my mind reeling from the onslaught of information. Because you were open to it, the being replied. Because you spent so many nights straddling the boundary between your world and ours. The veil between realities is thin in places like this, where human minds push themselves to their limits. I thought about all those late nights in the lab, the way my perception would shift after hours of staring at code, the strange ideas that would come to me in the early hours of the morning. What happens now? I asked, surprising myself with how calm I felt. The being's form rippled again, its multitude of eyes fixing on me. That's up to you, Michael. You can forget this. Return to your world and your limited perception. Or I prompted, or you can come with us. Learn the secrets of the universe. Become more than you ever dreamed possible. I hesitated. Part of me was screaming to run, to forget all of this and return to the safety of my normal life. But a larger part, the part that had always pushed me to learn more, to question everything, was thrilled at the prospect. Will I be able to come back? I asked. The being's laugh was like the tinkling of distant bells. Oh, Michael, once you've seen beyond the veil, there's no going back. Not really. You'll always know what's out there, always feel the pull of the infinite. I took a deep breath, looking around at the star-filled void that had replaced the familiar hallways of the computer science building. In that moment, I understood that everything was about to change. Okay, I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. I'm ready. The entity's shape shifted once more, extending what seemed to be a hand toward me. As I reached out to grasp it, I felt the final remnants of my old life slip away. In that fleeting moment, as I stepped over the threshold into a realm of boundless possibilities, one last thought flashed through my mind. I really should have just gone home when I first heard the whisper. But then again, where would the thrill have been in that? And with that, Michael Thompson, graduate student and soon-to-be master of computer science, vanished from the world he knew, setting off on an adventure beyond his wildest dreams. The computer lab returned to stillness, the unfinished thesis glowing faintly on the screen, waiting for a student who would never come back to finish it. I grew up as a military brat in San Diego, California. My dad served in the Marine Corps for 25 years, eventually reaching the rank of gunnery sergeant before retiring in 2011. I'm really proud of him and love him deeply, but I won't sugarcoat the reality. Growing up with a parent in the military wasn't always easy. He wasn't home a lot, and when he was, he often took on the role of disciplinarian. I didn't have as much freedom as some of my friends, but looking back, that was both a blessing and a curse. It kept me focused on school and gave me the foundation to get into a good college later in life. However, without a doubt, the hardest part of him being in the Marines was when he had to deploy. While he wasn't part of the initial invasion, Dad was sent to Iraq in June of 2003. I was 11 years old at the time, and saying goodbye to him was one of the hardest things I've ever done. No matter how much he reassured us, I was old enough to understand that it could have been the last time I saw him, the last time I hugged him, the last time I got to speak to him. The following 6 months were some of the most stressful of my life. Every news report on TV gave me a wave of anxiety. And every time we heard about a serviceman being killed, I feared the worst. My mom tried to protect me as much as she could, but to be honest, I was smart, inquisitive, and sensitive, and she could only do so much to ease my worries. So in September of 2003, she decided to take me to Disneyland for the weekend, hoping it would take my mind off things. Looking back, it was exactly what I needed. I was a huge fan of Disney movies growing up, and even though I had been to Disneyland before, this time felt different. With everything weighing on me at home, seeing it all again was like experiencing it through fresh eyes. I took pictures with as many characters as I could, and each ride we went on seemed to ease my anxiety and depression a little more. The first day was going perfectly. That was until we got in line for the Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. It must have been around 11:30 by the time we boarded the little rail cars for the ride. First, everything was smooth. We were speeding around the twists and turns, and then we hit a fake desert scene, followed by an incline into a dark tunnel. I remember this sudden jolt that shook the cars as we were plunged into darkness. Then, I heard a horrible grinding noise, followed by a thud, and before I knew it, people in the cars ahead of us started screaming. Everything came to a sudden stop and everyone was all really shaken up from it. But it's then that I heard some of the worst things I've ever heard in my life. This woman starts asking, "Mark? Mark? Mark? Wake up? Wake up, Mark?" We are all mostly in the dark, but there's a little bit of light coming from the openings of the tunnel on each side of us. And I remember seeing how some of the cars weren't even on the track anymore, and that the cars in front of us were all wet and shiny with some kind of fluid. A fluid that I would only later realize to be someone's blood. In the moments after the rail cars came to a stop, people started clambering out of them and walking down the tunnel as fast as they could, calling out that someone was really, really badly hurt and that we needed help up there as soon as possible. As me and my mom climbed out of the rail car and followed, I could see that the train car thing at the very front of the coaster had derailed and that the rear of the thing had mounted the car behind it. It was only then that I realized that whoever was in the car behind it would have taken the full force of the thing as we sped up that incline. But there were also people in the cars ahead of us who were trapped by it, stuck in the rail cars and unable to get out because of the way they were positioned in the tunnel. Thankfully, me and my mom weren't trapped, so we could just get out of there. But I think it took another half an hour before firefighters could get them out so that paramedics could treat them before taking them to the hospital. All the people that could get out were herded by park staff towards the River Bell Terrace, where a medical treatment area had been set up. Like I said, me and Mom were mostly okay, just a little shaken up from the whole thing. But there were people with some pretty serious injuries who hadn't been so lucky, and we later found out that a guy who had been in the first car had actually died of his injuries. It's horrendously tragic that someone should lose their life when all they wanted to do was go to Disneyland and have fun on a few roller coasters. And I know it's kind of messed up for me to think of it like this, but we really got lucky that day as way more people could have died. And honestly, I was surprised when I found out that it was only one person that lost their life that day. At least half the riders on that coaster could have died from the way the train just straight up mounted the cars behind it. Since that day, I have never ever ridden a roller coaster, and theme parks in general just kind of creep me out. I know they are super fun, and I hope I get past my fear of them one day, but for the time being, I'm more than happy to just avoid them and stay safe. Because even the sound of people screaming while having fun on them reminds me of Big Thunder Mountain and the way that poor woman just kept screaming for her husband or son or whoever he was to wake up. To give a bit of background on my situation, I'm a 27-year-old female, and I've lived in my current home for almost 13 years now. This house originally belonged to my maternal grandparents. My family moved in to care for my grandmother, who was ill at the time. Sadly, she passed away 3 years ago, but we continue to stay here to help take care of my grandfather. My grandfather is the second person to own this house. The couple before us bought it when it was built in the 70s, but they only lived here for a few years before moving away. The point is, this house doesn't have much history besides my family being the primary inhabitants. But despite that, I've never felt comfortable living here. We moved in at the end of my sophomore year in high school, and from the start, I've always felt uneasy. I'm convinced that my house is a breeding ground for negative energy. Without getting into all the details about my family's personal struggles, there's a constant tension here. People are always fighting, and mental illness runs deep in my family. The atmosphere is just thick with aggression and overwhelming stress. It's no surprise that paranormal things happen here. At first, it was small stuff. Hearing my name called when no one was around, finding lights turned on when I was sure I had turned them off, catching glimpses of things in the corner of my eye, items going missing only to reappear later, or feeling a cold chill on the back of my neck, like someone was standing behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. I didn't pay too much attention to it. It was odd, but not enough to lose sleep over. But then 2013 came, and that's when everything changed. I started having these bouts of insomnia that I had never experienced before. I'd had insomnia in the past, but this was different. It felt like my body just wouldn't let me sleep, like it was waiting for something. And then, late at night, I began to smell something burning. Not like a campfire or cooking, but like something was actively on fire. The first time I smelled it, I jumped up and immediately ran through the whole house, checking to make sure it wasn't burning down while everyone was asleep. It's a small, single-floor home with no basement and only a crawl-space attic, so I was able to check quickly. I felt the walls and ceilings for any heat, but there was nothing. I went outside to check the neighbors' houses and our sheds, all while this intense smell of fire lingered in the air. But there was no sign of a fire anywhere. It was so strong, I felt like I was choking on it, but after a few minutes, the smell just vanished. This went on for weeks. Every night, the smell would return, and every night, I would go through the same routine of checking the house, convinced something was about to catch fire. I started walking around the outside of the house every night to check for a fire, but I never saw anything. After about 2 weeks of this, I started noticing small sparks of light on the ceilings, following me as I walked through the rooms. It was like a dying sparkler, a tiny burst of light that would appear above my head as I walked. The light didn't show up every night, but it only appeared when I smelled the fire. Interestingly, the light never followed me into my room when I finished my rounds. Around the same time, the frequency of whispers I heard during the day increased, and things started going missing more often. The whole situation felt like it was escalating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The smell, the lights, and the whispers. It all felt connected, but I couldn't figure out what was happening. Things started to escalate. Along with the smells, lights, and visions, I began hearing soft sighs and whimpers outside my window at random times during the day. They didn't sound like an animal or a person, just unsettling noises that I couldn't explain. I checked the area outside, but there was never anything there. These activities, though deeply unsettling and weighing heavily on my mental well-being, began to feel somewhat mundane and predictable over time. But the situation worsened when I started seeing people. The first one was the little girl in my kitchen. One night, I got up to grab a snack, and as I turned the corner to step into my dark kitchen, a clear figure of a girl appeared directly in front of me, blocking the doorway. Though there were no distinguishable features, I instantly knew she was a child. Long hair, wearing a dress. She was at least a full foot shorter than me, and I'm 4 feet 10 inches. She approached so suddenly and so closely that I gasped and immediately reached for the light switch to my right. Without breaking eye contact with her dark silhouette, I flicked the light on and watched as she vanished right in front of me. Then there was the man who stood in the corner of my room. I first began to notice him after the little girl. For many nights, I would catch him in the corner of my eye, never daring to look directly at him. He wasn't there every night and didn't appear all the time. But when he was there, he was always in the far right corner of my room. Eventually, I gathered the courage to look directly at him. Like the others, he had no distinct features, but I could tell he was a man around 5 feet 10 inches with a broad build. He wore a hat, which was strange. When I was laying in bed, my feet were aligned with the door, but he was always facing perpendicular to me, his body angled toward the door. Though his presence made me uneasy, he never really moved. The only one who truly terrified me was the man at the foot of my bed. He appeared more frequently than the little girl, but less often than the man in the corner. What was odd about him was that I could always feel his presence before I saw him. Looking directly at him made me dizzy, so I would try to keep my eyes closed until I felt like he was gone. He was tall and slender, and of all the apparitions, he was the most distorted. He always stayed at the foot of my bed, but sometimes he would lean over just a little or sometimes a lot. He was always staring at me, and I could never shake the feeling that he was watching me. I really hate to think about him. It makes my stomach drop and my chest feel heavy. For months in 2013, my nights consisted of variations of these events. A few times, all three appeared in the same night. Only once did the two men appear to me at the same time. But just as quickly as everything started, it stopped. I no longer saw them. The smell of fire faded, and the lights stopped appearing on the ceiling. However, I still hear the whispers, and I probably always will. It's 2020 now, and my life has changed quite a bit since all of that happened. I put myself through college, established my career, landed a great job, and I've been saving for my future. But in the last 2 months, something has changed again. You see, during the pandemic, I got laid off and have spent most of the last month and a half at home. About 3 weeks ago, I saw her again, the little girl. But this time, she was in the reflection of the mirror at the end of my hallway. The mirror is floor to ceiling, and even though it was during the day, the hallway was dark. I could just see her standing behind me in the reflection, but when I turned around, she wasn't there. Twice last week, I woke up to a cool shiver running down my spine, jolting me from my sleep. Occasionally, I'll feel this presence at the back of my neck when I walk through my house. And just 3 nights ago, I saw him again. At first, when I sensed him, I thought I was going to pass out. My stomach turned and my vision blurred. When I finally allowed myself to look, there he was. But this time, he wasn't at the end of my bed where I expected him to be. He was right next to me, on my side, and much closer than before. I honestly wanted to cry, but I was so terrified that I could only hold my breath, feeling like it was an eternity. When I finally felt like he was gone, I rushed to turn the lights on. But once again, there was nobody there. I'm filled with dread and anxiety now. Every night since then, I've slept with my lights on, doing everything I can not to see them again. But I can't help but notice when they're around. I don't know why they came to me last time, and I certainly don't know why they're back now. Most of all, I don't know how to make it stop. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Any advice on how to make it stop? When I was 9 years old, my parents bought a rundown farm deep in the woods of Sweden. This wasn't the first time they had done something like this. They had previously bought and sold another farm after making it livable. Although I was sad to leave the first farm behind, I looked forward to the new adventure that awaited us on this one. Nothing particularly spooky ever happened on the first farm. I was never scared of the old house or the surrounding woods. In fact, I loved spending hours on my own in the woods, playing and creating dens for picnics with my imaginary adventure team. But things changed when we bought the second farm. The first few times we came to work on the house, painting and fixing it up, nothing unusual happened. I spent most of my time exploring the buildings on the property. The farm had 4 buildings: the main house, a garage, a stable, and a 4th building we could never fully explore. It had been badly damaged, possibly burned down, but at the time I was really into horses and spent a lot of time at the stables. It wasn't until about a year after we moved in that the first strange thing happened. I was playing in the stable, just messing around with some hay, when I suddenly felt as though someone was choking me. It felt like hands were wrapped around my neck, squeezing, and I couldn't breathe. I immediately ran out of the stable, and when I saw my mom, I was able to breathe again, but I couldn't stop coughing and wheezing. My throat hurt so much that I struggled to explain what had happened, and I kept coughing uncontrollably. My mom rushed me inside and got me some water, but I was still coughing after 15 minutes. She decided to take me to the hospital while my dad stayed with my brothers. Eventually, I stopped coughing, but the doctors couldn't figure out what had happened. To clarify, up until I was 14, I had no allergies, and my first asthma attack didn't happen until I was 13. In hindsight, I now know what an asthma attack feels like, and I don't think what happened that day was asthma. But at the time, it was written off as just that. Afterward, I stopped playing in the stable, opting to play in the woods with my brothers instead. When I was around 11, something happened that shook me even more. I woke up in the middle of the night and heard someone walking around the house. I got out of bed and passed by my parents' room, where they were sleeping. I walked into the kitchen, and that's when I saw a black figure standing in the middle of the room. Had I not looked closely, I might have thought it was my dad. But something about it didn't feel right. I froze, and this overwhelming feeling came over me. So I turned around and went back to my bed. Couldn't sleep that night. It felt like someone was watching me, and I was filled with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The next day, I told my parents I'd seen a man in the kitchen, but they just said I must have been dreaming. I might have been, but after that, I always felt like I wasn't welcome in the house, like there were eyes on me at all times. Then, one particular experience completely terrified me and made me beg my parents to leave me with my grandparents whenever they went to the farm after that. One day, I was sitting at my computer, chatting with some online friends and playing a game. My parents were about to go grocery shopping and asked if I wanted to come with them. I declined when my parents asked if I wanted to go grocery shopping, too absorbed in my game at the time. They asked if I was sure, but I nodded and they left me with my brothers. Almost immediately after the door slammed shut behind them, I regretted my decision. A deep sense of terror overtook me. I started scanning the room, my eyes darting around in fear, expecting to see something I shouldn't. The sound of the car pulling away on the dirt road slowly faded, and I was left in complete silence. That silence grew louder and louder until it was almost deafening. Suddenly, I felt a pop in my ears, and I began shaking uncontrollably, my teeth chattering from the fear. Then I heard a tap. Another tap followed by another, each tap in a predictable rhythm. I knew it would be at least 2 hours before my parents would return, as the grocery store was miles away, and I had no choice but to endure the growing dread. But something inside me snapped when I saw it. A figure, creeping towards me in the doorway of the kitchen. This time, I knew for sure it wasn't a dream. My lungs felt crushed, and an instant headache hit me. I stared at the figure for what felt like an eternity, at least 5 seconds. Then, panic surged through me, and I sprinted out of the back door and into the dirt road, my flip-flops from breakfast still on my feet. I ran, heading toward the neighbor's house about a 20-minute walk away, desperate for help. I didn't expect to see our car coming down the road, but to my relief, I did. My parents pulled up, asked what had happened, and I burst into tears. They quickly put me in the car, but I refused to go back inside the house. They told me I was being paranoid, that I'd imagined it all, but I stand by what I saw. Years later, I still can't shake the feeling of that place, and I've only visited the farm once since then. But I never went back after that. Whatever was on that farm, whatever it was that I encountered, seemed to have a particular disdain for me. There's one thing that has been bothering me, though. How long was I frozen in place, paralyzed by fear? Like I said, it takes hours for my parents to go grocery shopping, and it felt like the entire experience happened in maybe 5 or 10 minutes. To be honest, I don't even want to know. I'm just relieved that I don't have to go back there again. My childhood was filled with terrifying and unsettling incidents, but one particular event stands out above the rest. My parents split up when I was very young, and I lived with my father. We lived in a remote area, though there were a few other people on our street. The street was long, lonely, and isolated. We lived toward the end of it, and in the middle of the street lived a woman who I thought was really strange. She lived in a trailer, and one time when I was walking by with a neighbor boy, she tried to sell me some candy. I wasn't scared at the time, but I told her I didn't have any money, and she laughed at me when I said that. Like I said, she was really weird. What's even stranger is that my father started dating her sometime after we moved in. She never came over to our house, but occasionally my father would visit her. So living on this street was already strange. It felt like odd or unsettling things were always happening. Unusual people would drive down the road, throw parties, and sometimes light a tree on fire using gasoline. It seemed like everyone on that street was strange, except for me and my father. I always wondered what my dad saw in that weird woman, but I was too young to really understand. One night, things took a horrifying turn. I was in my room, playing with something, when the lights suddenly went off. I got up and opened my door. My bedroom was on the second floor, so I called out for my father. He didn't answer. I was confused because we had just had dinner together less than an hour ago in the dining room downstairs. I called again, but still got no response. I went downstairs and outside, and I saw a police car drive by and stop at our neighbor's house. I stood there watching when suddenly my father surprised me from behind. He told me we needed to go back inside. When we got in, my father was frantic. He told me we needed to hide because someone had hurt his girlfriend, the strange woman down the street, and that the person was coming toward our house. I was terrified, but I agreed to hide. We went upstairs into the spare room next to mine. It was dark outside, and all the lights were out. I told him the lights weren't working, but he didn't seem to listen. He tried to turn the light on, but it didn't work. He cursed under his breath and then told me to get down on the ground. He said he could hear someone coming up the stairs. I started to tear up, too frightened to even speak. He told me he was going to confront the person in our house and wanted me to stay put. I begged him to stay, but he insisted. He left me crying on the floor and walked out of the room. Felt like forever, and then I heard nothing. But then I heard something. The floorboards outside my bedroom door creaked, as if someone was standing there. I froze in terror, too scared to even call out for my father, even though I desperately wanted to. Then, I heard the person run down the hall and down the stairs. I remembered that our old house was built in such a way that you could walk around the roof of the second story and enter the bedrooms through the windows. I turned and looked outside and saw only darkness. I decided to open the window and climb out. I moved around the window where I was out of sight and sat there in the dark for a time. After waiting for a few minutes, I finally made the choice to jump down to the first story roof and then jump down again to the ground. I did, but I hurt my ankle in the process. I sat right where I landed, rubbing my ankle, and the scariest thing that has ever happened. Somebody standing about 5 feet away started walking in my direction. I looked up to see a figure in the darkness standing there, obviously looking at me. They didn't move. I did, however. I got up and ran up the driveway to the street and over to my neighbor's house. There was a bunch of stuff going on. People were walking around, panicked. The police had come and asked everyone questions, and they told me they had come to our house too, but nobody answered the door. I asked my neighbor to take me to my house to get my father, but they just said no every time I asked. Very late that night, the police came again and dropped a bombshell on me and my neighbor. My father was found in the back pasture and was arrested for murder. He had killed his girlfriend, that weird woman down the street, and was trying to pretend like somebody else was in our house. He was sentenced to 12 to 20 years for second-degree murder, and I've kept in contact with him. I've asked him many times why he left the room I was in that night, why he ran around the house trying to scare me, and pretended to be someone else, and he would just always say he didn't know. In 2007, when I was 7 years old, my single mom started dating a man who lived in a campground, and soon my older brother, mom, and I moved in with him. While most campgrounds are seasonal and not meant for year-round living, this one had a large section in the front for campers and a row of trailers in the back where people lived full-time. Most of the residents were older folks looking for an affordable, nature-filled place to live, and there was just one other family with kids my age. Could get lonely during the off-season when no families visited, but during the summer, a lot of families stayed, and I got to make new friends and reunite with those who returned every year. Summers at the campground were a blast for a kid. There was a big pool in the center, a pavilion that hosted parties nearly every night, and lots of new faces coming and going as the season progressed. However, the influx of strangers made my mom cautious, and she always reminded me that not all adults were kind, especially considering how many were drinking during their vacations. Fortunately, I never really encountered anyone truly dangerous during the 7 years we lived there. Just a few oddballs and a lot of drunks. Most people were either friendly or kept to themselves. But one summer, a rumor began circulating among the kids at the campground. I heard that an elderly couple visiting that summer had been spotted several times staring into people's windows, following them around at night, and even allegedly walking in on people using the public showers. I didn't pay much attention to the rumor, since it seemed like the typical scary stories kids tell each other in a place like that. I hadn't personally come across any creepy old people. I guess the rumor reached my mom because she started reminding me to always close my blinds at night, just in case. Since she took it seriously, I decided to do the same. But as the nights grew unbearably hot, I started leaving my window and blinds open to let some cooler air into my room. I hadn't had any strange experiences for days, so I figured the rumors were just that, rumors, and continued to keep my window open. One night, I was lying in bed, playing my DS and watching old Disney Channel sitcoms around 1 a.m., when I began to hear rustling outside. This wasn't unusual since we had outdoor cats who liked to play in the leaves, and it wasn't uncommon for deer, raccoons, coyotes, and other wildlife to pass through our yard, entering and leaving the woods behind the trailers. Living in the country, the nights were just as lively as the days with wildlife. However, this rustling seemed louder than what I was used to. Whatever was causing the noise wasn't as light-footed as the usual animals. My bed was right in front of the window, so I would have had to turn around completely to look outside. I was too tired to bother, even if it meant catching a glimpse of a coyote. After a while, the noises stopped, and I completely forgot about them as I kept playing my game. About 15 minutes later or so, I heard an incredibly strange noise. However, it sounded like a fingernail scratching against the mesh screen in my window. I immediately started to feel anxious. The cats couldn't reach my window, and no wild animal would care to come that close to a bright window. Instinctively, I turned around to see what made the noise. Right outside my window was an elderly man, wide eyes and a big toothless grin, face practically pressed against my window. His expression wasn't at all what I would have expected. He looked so genuinely happy to see me, as if he had been waiting all that time for me to turn around and notice him. Instead of screaming for my mom or my brother, I froze up, just staring at this face in my window for what felt like minutes, but was probably more like seconds, before I grabbed the blinds rod and rapidly twisted it, closing my blinds and throwing my blankets over my head. I remember trying to take shallow breaths as though I were afraid he would hear me despite already having seen me. I tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination or maybe even my own reflection distorted, but I knew that what I saw was real. It was inches away from me, separated only by a thin mesh screen. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because as soon as I woke up, I rushed to tell my mom what had happened. She immediately called the campground's owners, pretty close friends of ours, and they informed us that the old man, along with his wife, had already been kicked out. Apparently, after I closed my blinds and shut him out, the old man went to another trailer with an open window, one belonging to one of my neighbors who was also still awake. She called the campground owners, who immediately called the cops, and they evicted him along with his wife, who was apparently making her rounds peering into the windows of the campers up front. They had been doing this for over a week and finally had been caught. To this day, I am not really sure what their motives were. It could have been a source of perverse pleasure to them, or it could have simply been an exciting hobby of theirs, seeing how long they could stare at people before they noticed. Regardless, this event shook me quite a bit, and it was a long time before I was comfortable even having my blinds open whatsoever. I was more than willing to suffocate in the summer heat if it meant not risking being spied on again. I lived in that campground for 7 years, and my childhood was certainly interesting due to it. I mean, what kid doesn't want to live in a place that's a 24/7 vacation? But the voyeuristic couple who came to visit in the summer of 2008 definitely changed my perspective. The first time I noticed something was off, it was with my favorite coffee mug. I could have sworn I'd left it in the sink, but when I walked into the kitchen, there it was, sitting clean and dry on the counter. I brushed it off as forgetfulness, maybe a side effect of the long hours I'd been working. But as the days passed, more things began to feel wrong. Little did I know, this would only be the start of a nightmare that would turn my home into a prison of fear and suspicion. I had been living in the apartment for about 6 months. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom place in a quiet part of town. The rent was affordable and my landlord, Mr. Keegan, seemed like a decent guy. He was older, probably in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a constant look of weariness on his face. First, everything was normal. I come home from work, make some dinner, maybe watch TV, and then go to bed. But then, things began to change. It was subtle at first. A book left in the wrong place here. A chair slightly shifted there. I convinced myself I was just being absent-minded, too stressed from my job to keep track of where I put things. But then, I started noticing bigger things. One evening, I came home to find my laptop open on the coffee table. I always shut it down and put it away before leaving for work. Another time, I found wet footprints leading from the bathroom to the front door. Footprints that were too large to be mine. That's when the unease started creeping in. I'd walk into a room and feel like someone had just been there. The air would feel different, disturbed somehow. I'd catch faint whiffs of unfamiliar cologne or hear the soft echo of footsteps when I knew I was alone. I thought about talking to Mr. Keegan, but what could I say? That I was convinced someone was sneaking into my apartment and moving my things around? He'd think I was crazy. So, I kept quiet, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But then came the night that changed everything. I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I couldn't figure out what. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. As I lay there, trying to calm myself, I heard it. The soft creak of a floorboard from the living room. I froze, barely daring to breathe. There it was again, closer this time. Someone was in my apartment. Panic seized me. I reached for my phone, ready to dial 911, but my fingers hovered over the keypad. What if they heard me? What if they came into my room? The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I could see the shadow of feet in the gap beneath the door. My whole body tensed, waiting for the handle to turn. But it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow moved away, and I heard the soft click of the front door closing. I didn't move for hours, too terrified to check if they were really gone. When the first light of dawn started to creep through my curtains, I finally found the courage to get up. The apartment looked normal. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. If it weren't for the lingering scent of that unfamiliar cologne, I might have convinced myself it was all a bad dream. I called in sick to work that day. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving my apartment unattended. Instead, I went to the hardware store and bought new locks for my doors and windows. I installed them all myself, my hands shaking the entire time. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining I heard footsteps, kept seeing shadows move out of the corner of my eye. The next day, exhausted and on edge, I decided I needed proof. I went out and bought a small security camera, the kind you can hide easily. I set it up in my living room, angled to capture most of the apartment. For days, nothing happened. The camera recorded hours of empty rooms and me going about my daily routine. I started to think that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. That stress and lack of sleep had made me paranoid. And then a week after I installed the camera, it happened. I was at work when I got the notification on my phone that the camera had detected movement. With shaking hands, I opened the app and watched the live feed. There was someone in my apartment, a man, moving around my living room like he owned the place. As he turned towards the camera, I felt my blood run cold. It was Mr. Keegan. I watched in horror as he casually walked through my home, picking things up and examining them. He went into my bedroom, staying there for far too long. When he came out, he was carrying one of my sweaters. He held it to his face and inhaled deeply before putting it back. I felt sick. This couldn't be happening. How long had this been going on? How many times had he been in my home while I was away? While I was sleeping? I left work early, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront him? Call the police? Move out immediately? When I got home, everything looked normal, just like always. But now I knew the truth. I could almost see the ghost of Mr. Keegan moving through my rooms, touching my things, invading my privacy. I couldn't stay there. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend, showing her the video footage and explaining everything. She insisted we go to the police. The officers took my statement and watched the video. They seemed concerned, but warned me that since Mr. Keegan was the landlord and technically had the right to enter for maintenance, it might be hard to prove criminal intent. Still, they agreed to investigate. They interviewed Mr. Keegan, who apparently broke down and confessed almost immediately. He'd been doing this for years, he said, to multiple tenants. The police found evidence in his own apartment, photographs, stolen items, detailed journals of his intrusions. I never went back to that apartment. I couldn't bear the thought of being in that space, knowing what had happened there. Even after moving to a new place, it took months before I could relax in my own home again. Sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear footsteps outside my door. I have to remind myself that it's over, that I'm safe now, but a part of me wonders if I'll ever truly feel secure again. The experience taught me a harsh lesson about trust and privacy. We like to think of our homes as sanctuaries, as the one place where we can truly be ourselves. But the truth is, we're vulnerable even in our most private spaces. The locks on our doors can't always keep out the monsters, especially when the monster has a key. Now, I always check my security cameras before I go to bed. I've got sensors on all my doors and windows. Some might call it paranoia, but I prefer to think of it as self-preservation, because I know, firsthand, that the greatest threats aren't always the strangers lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes, they're the familiar faces we see every day, hiding dark secrets behind friendly smiles. Mr. Keegan is in prison now, but I often think about his other victims. How many lives did he invade? How many people are out there, feeling uncomfortable in their own homes, unable to figure out why? And how many other Mr. Keegans are out there, holding the keys to apartments, hiding behind the guise of helpful landlords? I don't have answers to these questions. All I know is that I'll never take my privacy for granted again. Because once it's been violated, you realize just how precious and fragile it truly is, and no lock in the world can restore that sense of safety once it's been shattered. This happened when I was around 4 or 5 years old, and I'm 15 now. Looking back, I can't believe I didn't recognize the red flags at the time. I was so young and naive, I didn't see anything wrong with the situation. I thought the guy was just being friendly. The whole thing took place in a mall in broad daylight with tons of people around. My mom and I were having a fun shopping day together when, at some point, I got lost. I'm sure a lot of people have a similar story, right? So far, everything seemed normal. I remember seeing a man with a strong southeastern accent. He was dressed poorly, like someone who was down on their luck. But in my 5-year-old mind, I thought he seemed fine. So, as a lost little girl, I walked up to him, asking if he'd seen my mom or knew how to get back to her. He didn't answer my questions, but when he saw me, his expression changed. His eyes lit up, and he immediately began complimenting me. Some of the things he said were downright inappropriate for a 5-year-old. He gave me a pink and black bracelet, telling me how pretty it looked on me. I, of course, didn't understand the implications and completely ignored the red flags. Then, he made an offer that sounded like something out of a fairy tale. He said he could take me to his private jet, fly me to Jamaica, and I could play with dolphins. He made it sound like the ultimate paradise for a little kid, and all I had to do was get into his car. Naturally, I trusted him, thinking it was a dream come true. But just as I was about to leave the mall with him, a man in a suit and tie stepped in front of us, blocking our path. He asked the guy where he was taking a 5-year-old girl. It was obvious we weren't related. The man in the suit then asked the guy who he was, and the man with the accent replied, saying that I was his daughter's kid and he was just taking me home. Clearly, we weren't related, so the man in the suit asked me where my mom was. I told him she was still inside the mall. From there, things got heated between the two men. I didn't understand most of it, but I ended up leaving with the man in the suit, while the guy with the southeastern accent cursed him out. We went to the mall lobby, where my mom was waiting and talking to the desk worker, describing me. She had figured out I was missing by then. It turned out the man in the suit was a mall security guard, and he had noticed how strange and wrong the situation was. When my mom saw me with the security guard, she immediately scooped me up into a big hug. This happened a long time ago, but it came back to me recently when some friends mentioned they were going to Jamaica for vacation. That's when the memories flooded back. So to the security guard who noticed how wrong it was and stepped in, thank you. I will always be grateful. I left work late one night, later than usual. As I was driving home, I unexpectedly ran into some construction, forcing me to take a detour. I turned right onto a street I rarely ever used, one I hadn't been on in years. This street led me into the downtown area of my city, which wasn't exactly a nice place to be. Crime was common in this area, and it made me nervous, especially since it was late and there were no other cars around. I stopped at a stop sign, and I must have made a wrong turn because when I looked around, I noticed the detour signs were gone. I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket, which was sitting on the passenger seat, to use GPS and help guide me home. As I was using the phone, I heard a noise outside. I looked up to see what it was. I spotted a woman about 30 yards away from my car, standing in the parking lot of a convenience store that was now closed. She was off in the corner of the store, in a much darker area. I noticed right away that she looked scared, and almost immediately, I saw a man reach out from the side of the building, grab her by the arm and pull her out of sight. The woman made a noise again. I was scared to death and didn't know what to do. My first thought was that maybe he was trying to rob her, but then I realized he might be trying to do something worse. I'm not the toughest guy around, and I've only been in a few fights in my life, but there was no way I was going to just let this woman be hurt while I was right here. So I took a deep breath, opened my car door, and got out. I heard her again, this time sounding like a half scream, half cry for help, but it was muffled, like the man was covering her mouth. I walked around to the back of my car and started towards where she had disappeared. I walked as fast as I could but tried to be as quiet as possible. As I walked, her noises suddenly stopped, and I got scared. Scared of what I might find, scared of what I might have to do. I reached the corner of the store and peered slowly around the edge, looking into the dark side of the building. At first, I didn't see anything, so I moved closer. That's when I saw them. They were standing in the dark, side by side, like statues. He wasn't touching her, and she wasn't crying or screaming. They weren't fighting. It hit me then what was really happening. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted back toward my car. As I ran, I could hear them chasing me. I reached my car, threw open the door, jumped inside, and locked it. Right as I did, they tried to open the doors from both sides. I quickly started the car, slammed the pedal to the floor, and took off. I was so shaken by what had just happened that I ran 2 stop signs right after. I drove home, never got a good look at their faces, and I haven't been down that street since. I work as a 911 dispatcher on the night shift, covering 12-hour shifts alongside one partner. That night, I was with my partner, Mike, but due to a shift schedule change, I'm no longer paired with him. For context, our agency handles fire and EMS dispatch, not law enforcement. Our dispatch center is located within a fire station, where the building is shared only by 2 dispatchers and 2 medics. There's a separate, larger building across the parking lot where our administrative staff, like HR and payroll, work during business hours. After 5 p.m. and on weekends, that building is empty. Inside the admin building, there's a well-appointed firefighter's quarters with a full kitchen, a pool table, a couple of large couches, and a TV. Our fire department is volunteer-based, so the quarters aren't usually occupied unless there's an event or someone is on duty. Since the shifts are long, I occasionally cook when things are quiet. Our dispatch center has a small kitchen, but we often lack some basic items like pots or pans. When that happens, I head over to the firefighter quarters because they tend to have what we need. A few months ago, around 2:30 a.m., I was trying to bake banana bread, but we were missing a bread pan. I told Mike I was heading to the admin building to grab one, then grabbed my badge to buzz myself in after hours. I stepped out into the chilly night air and made the short walk to the admin building. Flashing my badge at the buzzer, I heard the lock click open. The night was pitch black, with only the building's exterior lights illuminating the area, leaving the inside in near darkness. I entered, turned to my right to buzz into the firefighters' quarters, and tucked my phone with my Spotify playlist into my back pocket. Once inside, I flipped on the kitchen lights, leaving the others off, and began searching through the cabinets for the bread pan. After some time with no luck, I decided to check the large pantry. As I rifled through the shelves, I suddenly heard a muffled bang from the lobby outside the quarters. It wasn't deafening, but it was enough to cut through the music playing at half volume. I stop and freeze. I thought for a second that maybe Mike had followed me over to come check on me since it was taking me a long time. That was quickly debunked when I realized two things. First, even if he was worried, he couldn't leave dispatch without anyone at a console ready to answer a 911 call. Second, I had my cell phone on me, so he would have just called or texted me, not followed me over. My second thought was that I left the doors unlocked and somebody followed me in. That was also quickly debunked because the doors aren't manually locked and unlocked. They automatically lock 10 seconds after the initial buzz in. I quickly found myself on edge, but figured that it was probably just the loud air ducts or heating, as it was a very large building. I kept rifling through the pantry without further incident. Still no bread pan. I exited the pantry, closed the doors, and walked over to the sink to check in the dishwasher, thinking someone may have used it and not put it away. Soon after I walked to the sink, a strong, unpleasant, and very recognizable scent took over my senses. It hit me all at once, and I couldn't believe how repulsive it smelled. As an EMT, I was able to identify the scent right away from the few times I'd encountered it. It was that of a decomposing body. I started commenting to myself how wretched it smelled and that the firefighters needed to man up and do a better job of keeping up with their kitchen. It was not a second after I made the remark about my lazy firefighters that I heard a deep, manly scoff and chuckle coming from the other side of the firefighter quarters. I was not immediately alarmed, slightly startled, but I just walked over to see who the hell happened to be in there at such a late hour without knowing that they were crewing. I walked out of the kitchen expecting to meet someone wearing a blue fire department shirt, but nobody made themselves readily known. I followed up with a curious, "Hello?" and I made an awkward chuckle as well, thinking about how stupid I looked, blindly looking for this firefighter who startled me. Nothing, and nobody, to explain the feeling that hit me harder than a freight train is impossible. My eyes began watering, but I was not about to cry. My arms were raised with goosebumps, and my heart was doing backflips in my chest. I looked left and then right to find nobody. I walked over to the light switch and flipped them all on. All of them switched on except for the one closest to the couches and TV, and I about lost all my stability. I looked over to the dark section with a couch facing away from me with a high back. My mind danced with fear as I imagined a crazed killer laying on the couch with a sinister smile spread across their face and hiding from me, but ready to jump up at any moment. I began rationalizing the situation and realized I was being way too jumpy and dramatic. I had to use my badge not once, but twice to gain access to where I currently was. So it was clear nobody was there who shouldn't be. I spoke up again, now really thinking it was a firefighter messing with me, which wouldn't be cool, but not completely out of the ordinary either. "Hey, you scared me. I'm just trying to find a bread pan. How come you didn't tell us you were crewing?" I began approaching the couches, hoping someone would answer me. Nobody responded. I stopped about halfway from the lights to the couch. I waited another second. Okay, screw off, honestly. Also, it smells like literal death in here, so you need to clean the hell up. It's nasty. At this point, I was getting real mad as the thought that a firefighter was just messing with me made more and more sense to me. It seemed cruel and a mean thing to do. Still, nobody answered me, and I again started to second-guess myself. And maybe it was my music that somehow sounded like a male laughing. I took a deep breath and went to grab my badge and close the dishwasher. It was clear I wasn't going to find my pan. I walked over to the dishwasher where it previously smelled of rotting flesh. And much to my surprise, it no longer smelled like that rotting, almost bitter smell. I slammed the dishwasher shut and turned to leave. I switched off the lights and pressed the bar to walk out the door when I heard what sounded like nails against a bumpy, textured wall coming from behind me. The air felt still as I whipped back around, getting ready to lay hard into this jerk trying to scare me. I wanted to know how screwed he would be once the chief caught wind of this. After all, it was way too early for these kinds of shenanigans, and I was over it. Despite being a smaller female, I was about ready to teach this idiot a lesson or two. I looked around again, but there was still no one in sight. The sound, however, continued, now sounding more like shuffling. My heart raced, and I backed up into the press bar with more force than before, nearly tumbling through the doorway. My feet scrambled to catch up with my suddenly panicked body, and I quickly turned to dash out of the firefighters' quarters. As I sped through the admin building, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a dark figure standing at the far end of the long lobby near the side exit. What sent chills down my spine was the way his silhouette was faintly highlighted by the green exit sign. In that brief moment, all I could make out was the outline of a large person, and that was enough for me to realize that no one should have been in that building. I bolted across the parking lot back to dispatch, buzzing myself in. I quickly apologized to Mike for taking so long and rushed to tell him everything that had just happened. He was stunned, never having heard anything like it before. Mike's been a firefighter with our department for years, and he said no one had ever mentioned anything strange happening there. We decided to check the security cameras that monitor the admin building entrance. No one had left. The next morning, we went over the area, but everything was in its place, and there was no sign of anything unusual. As far as I know, there haven't been any fatalities on the property, and I haven't experienced anything like that again. I'm a rational person, as you'd expect from my job. I've been on the line for countless nightmares and have seen my share of chaos in the field, but that experience left a mark on me. The feeling of being watched by someone you can't see will never leave my memory.